Cursebreaker. Revealed. By Melinda Kusira. About Cursebreaker revealed. Sarn faces his worst nightmare. His son disappeared, and his best friends beaten and left for dead. To top it all off, the man who almost killed him 5 years ago might have his son. Sarn can't defeat him alone. Not when his magic will force him to obey that psychopath's orders. But what choice does he have? Once indentured, a man can claim nothing as his own, not even his son. With his home gone, there's nowhere left to hide. The truth is out, and it could destroy Sarn and his family. Cursebreaker Revealed is the third book in the Revelation arc. All secrets will be revealed. All lies will be exposed. The truth will out, and it will drag everyone into the light. No one will be spared. Who will survive the reckoning? Find out in Cursebreaker Revealed. Cursebreaker Revealed is the sequel to Cursebreaker Trapped. Chapter 1. A Chance Visit. Sarn followed his son through the corridor that led to the other side of the mountain where Inari and Nolo lived. But he didn't hurry, and that wasn't so Murrin had enough time to finish his homework. Last Friday's visit was short and awkward, and Sarn doubted this Friday would be any different. But worry twisted a knot in his gut despite that. One Friday, Inari wouldn't be home alone. Someone would visit, or Nolo would take a sick day, and he'd see Ran. It was inevitable now, and there was nothing Sarn could do about it, except try to choose times when Nolo wouldn't be home. But his hours were erratic since taking over for Gerlo a few weeks ago. How long would the commander take off from work? Another week? Surely no more than that. I wish he'd go to work like normal so Nolo could keep regular hours again. Sarn hadn't looked for Gerlo after their last run-in. I don't want to talk to him. Stop, Papa. We're here. Ran jerked his arm backward. Sarn blinked at the door in front of him. It wasn't a long walk, but he couldn't remember any of it. I see that. Are you sure? Because you would have walked into it if I hadn't stopped you. Ran looked at him with skeptical eyes, and he raised both brows in a silent question. Thank you for that. I don't want to walk into any doors. Sarn rubbed his face. He needed to think less and pay more attention to his surroundings. You're welcome. Ran knocked on the door in front of him. Inari, are you home? We came like we promised. The door opened. And I'm here like I promised. Inari smiled at Ran, and he smiled back, but her voice had an edge meant for Sarn. This was all his fault. Is Nolo home? Sarn rested a hand on Ran's shoulder to stop him from entering. No, he was called to a meeting about an hour ago. Come inside. Inari stepped away from the door. She wore the same blue dress as last Friday, but she'd pulled her hair back. Thank God he made time yesterday to do some laundry, so he and Ran both wore clean green tunics and trousers today. I hope that proves I'm a good parent. But it might not, and the threat of discovery hung in the air like a storm about to break. Are we going inside? Because that's where the cookies are. Ran pried at the hand on his shoulder. His son was right. They couldn't stand here on the threshold all afternoon because Sarn promised to meet Nolo at 20th bell. It was rude, and it wouldn't help his case. What would help at this point? Had they already passed the point of no return? Sarn shoved those thoughts aside before they could depress him. I won't lose Ran. I'll do whatever they ask to keep him. It was hard letting go, but Sarn did, one finger at a time, until Ran slipped out of his grasp and trudged inside. Sarn swallowed his trepidation and followed his son. He still felt like something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. The living room was neat and clean, and every rug, blanket, and pillow was in its place. Sarn stepped over a light-colored throw rug so his boots wouldn't leave black marks on it. His magic didn't sense anything amiss either when he queried it. But worry curled around his gut and squeezed it, despite the lack of evidence to support the uneasy feeling tensing him up. Did you make any cookies? I promised I'd bring Uncle Murrin some. Ran sniffed the air and smiled. Thankfully, he didn't sense that anything was wrong. But the boy was too trusting. Yes, I did. Would you like one? Inari gestured to the kitchen, but she didn't take her eyes off the door. Why was Inari so tense? Did she think he would hurt her? Is everything okay? Sarn rested a hand on his son's shoulder again, and stopped the boy from going any further into the apartment. Ran glanced around. I don't see anybody else here. Why wouldn't everything be okay? But he stayed close to Sarn. I don't know. That's what I'm trying to find out. Sarn called up his magic, but it didn't stray far from his side because he was tired and tense. It just scanned the hallway they stood in. But that wasn't helpful. Ran backed up until he stepped on Sarn's boots. Are we in trouble? I don't know. Sarn squeezed his son's shoulder, but he wouldn't find out if they were in trouble until Inari spoke. You can tell us what's wrong. If there's a monster here, Papa will get rid of it, and I'll help. Ran turned his cuteness on Inari and smiled. That was the last thing she expected him to say, and it melted her reserve. There are no monsters here. Well, there might be just one, but Sarn kept that to himself because he felt like a monster for what he'd done to her. Do you know what always makes me feel better? Ran tapped his chest. What? Inari crouched to be on his level. Cookies. They make everything better. We should have some. Ran bounced on his toes. All his worries fled at the thought of cookies. Inari laughed and extended her hand. And so we shall. Ran clasped her hand and slipped out of Sarn's grasp again. They strode through the living room to the table at the edge of the kitchen. But Inari kept glancing at the door behind him. Was she waiting for someone? No, she couldn't be. She promised not to tell anyone about Ran. A bad feeling sliced through Sarn. Were those footsteps in the hall? Are you expecting someone? Sarn leaned against the couch. He should take his son and go. He'd fulfilled his promise, but fear froze his feet to the spot. What if he ran into whoever was coming in the hallway? There would be nowhere to hide Ran. Papa, are you okay? You got pale and quiet, and you only get like that when you're scared. Are you scared, Papa? Ran glanced back at him as he entered the kitchen. But the promised cookies spurred him on. The outer door opened before Sarn could pull up his head map, and Ranaspara strode in. Sorry I'm late. I came as soon as I could. Your note didn't say what the problem was, just that it was urgent. So you'd better start talking. I need to get back out there. Inari. Where are you? Ranaspara stepped into the foyer. Oh, hello, Sarn. How are you? I'm glad you're better, and who is this? Ranaspara crouched when Ran rushed over to say hello. Sarn had told his son probably 1,000 times not to talk to strangers, but the boy never listened to him. He watched the tragedy play out in slow motion, but there wasn't anything he could do to stop it. Ran passed by just out of reach. Maybe he could have used his magic to grab the boy, but Sarn didn't call it, and it didn't rush to his aid either. Ran skidded to a halt in front of Ranaspara, and her eyes widened at the sight of him. Hi, I'm Ran. I'm his son. Ran pointed at Sarn. Who are you? Ran thrust his hand out. Ranaspara shook it. I'm Ranaspara. I'm Inari's friend, and I work with your father. Her gaze sought him out. Is he really your son? She mouthed that question so she didn't offend Ran. Sarn nodded as he dropped onto the couch and put his head in his hands. You can't tell anyone about him. They'll take him away from me if you do, and I can't live without him. No. Nobody's taking me away from you. You're the best papa in the world. Ran crashed into his legs. Damn it. He shouldn't have said that in front of Ran, but it was the truth. Sarn put his arms around his son, but nothing would ever be the same. Too many people knew about him now. It was only a matter of time before everyone knew. Then they'd take the boy away from him. I'm sorry. Inari rested a hand on his shoulder. What's going on? What did I interrupt? Ranaspara rose and faced Inari. We have a bargain. He'll come once a week with his son so I can make sure they're both all right. Inari gestured to them. Why wouldn't we be? Ran glared at them as he ticked his points off on his fingers. Papa takes good care of me, and so does Uncle Murren. We play games. We read books, and sometimes we have adventures, but not lately because Papa is busy lighting crystals and doing other magical stuff. I'm never too busy for you. Sarn hugged his son. I know. But you're too busy for adventures right now. And that's okay because people need light, and you must light the crystals. When I get more magic, I'll help you. Ran patted his knee. Sarn hoped that day never came. He couldn't imagine his son with his magic. Sarn didn't know what to do now either. Should he extract the same promise from Ranaspara? You don't have to worry. I won't tell anyone about him. Ranaspara sat across from Sarn. Do you promise? Ran squirmed until he faced her. Yeah, I promise. Ranaspara leaned forward and winked at him. And just like that, she was bound to her word. Sarn covered his face again with his hands. This time, he wasn't the one who'd bound her. Ran had done it with his little magical gift, and Sarn needed to have a long talk with him about that. Promises are binding for mages, Sarn reminded his son, even though it was too late. I know. Ran patted his knee again. But you needed that promise, and you didn't want to ask for it, so I did it for you. That's what family's for. Ran shrugged, then wriggled out of his arms. Can we have cookies now? Chapter 2. Where are we? Stramos turned and tried to make sense of his surroundings, but this hallway, or rather its decor and statuary, didn't look familiar. Plants sprouted in between statues of fighters, and there were more than he'd ever seen in a single hallway. Maybe he should have let Mosul stay in control for a while longer. We're not in the lower quarters anymore. That was the only thing Stramos was certain about, but he'd just woken up. No, we're upstairs. I was headed to our flat. Mosul took the passenger seat in their mind. Did you find them? Stramos hoped Mosul had. Metron and his friends disappeared a week ago, and they'd searched for them ever since then. But they hadn't found them. Where could they hide that would cloak them from me, while there's a piece of my darkness inside them? That was the one question Stramos couldn't answer, and it vexed him. No, I didn't find them while you rested. Maybe they left Mount Eridron altogether. They could have hopped on a ferry easily enough, and it could have carried them miles away from here by now. Mosul just had to point that out. While that could be true, Stramos didn't think Metron and his friends had left. They were too interested in Sarn and his son to just drop that and move on to something else. No, they were still here somewhere. How had they blocked him from knowing their location, or what they were doing? I guessed how to create a minion, and I could have missed a step. That could be it, or Metron and his friends could have found an object or place under Mount Eridron that blocked his magic. Anything was possible here. Yes, let me talk. I'm good at that, a child said from somewhere ahead, and his voice echoed in the hallway, followed by footsteps. I know that voice. It's Sarn's son. Stramos turned. Where was the boy? Not in this hallway. Maybe in an adjacent one? There was an intersection ahead. This was the first time the kid had left the flat in the last week. That's not a bad idea, Sarn said. Where was he headed? All questions about where Metron and his friends had gone disappeared from his mind. They no longer mattered since Sarn had his son with him. Stramos concentrated on the voices. Were they coming from that intersection? He hurried toward it and turned left into another hallway. Ahead, a familiar green glow preceded two dark man shapes, one adult and one child. I've got you now. Don't get too close. Sarn is powerful, Mosul said, proving he was back on his side. That was true. Stramos dropped back and slipped into the shadows behind Sarn and his son. The child chattered as he walked about cookies and stories, making it easy to follow them, even though Sarn didn't say much. He didn't need to. The child towing him talked enough for two people. Be careful. I don't want him to hurt you. Mosul stayed in the passenger seat, but he did reach over to slow them down. Excitement pushed Stramos into a sprint. But Mosul was right. He should slow down. The wound Sovan gave him didn't hurt much now. Maybe it was finally healing. Stramos could check that later. Stay back. He could blast us to smithereens. Mosul appeared in front of him with his hands extended to stop him. Stramos paused behind a statue of an axe-toting woman. Would Sarn blast them with his magic? Probably not. Heroes didn't do that kind of thing. Jealousy surged inside Stramos for what he could have been if a bunch of black magic practitioners hadn't summoned and imprisoned him. But they couldn't take his magic because that power was tied to the beast in his soul, and it threw its head back and howled for mage blood. No. Don't give in to it. Don't feed that beast. Mosul reached into their body and grabbed his spirit by the nape of his neck and dragged him back from the edge of madness. That's over and done with now and has been for years. They're all dead and you're free. Mosul walked into their body and wrapped his arms around his spirit. But no one controlled their body, so it slumped to the ground in the shadows as the mage and his son strode away. They never once glanced back as Stramos wrestled that beast down and the red tinge left his sight. He lay panting on the ground. His spirit and Mosul's were as entwined as the vines carved on the floor under their cheek. Were they really dead? Stramos wanted to believe that, but it was so hard. A stray cat patted over and bathed their face with her rough tongue as Stramos took control of their body again. The stone floor was cold. I'll never be truly free as long as I'm on this plane. Not while a piece of hell dwelled in him. But Mount Eridron was his home. Stramos rested a hand on his heart, and the area throbbed. I wish you'd let me redeem you somehow. There must be a way. Mosul backed away and took his place in the passenger seat, but he still could see through their eyes. There isn't. Stramos shook his head and rose. Where had Sarn and his son gone? He no longer heard the kid. Either the boy had shut up or they'd reached their destination. And I didn't see where that was. Stramos kicked a statue but not hard enough to hurt his foot. What will you do now? Mosul asked. That was a good question until the bits of himself he'd planted in Metron and his cronies finally responded. The foursome was on the move, but Stramos couldn't tell where they were. Were they going to Sarn's flat or somewhere else under the mountain? Stramos leaned against a wall and tried to connect with the bits of himself in Metron and his friends, but nothing happened. Their thoughts didn't drop into his mind. Damn. How is this whole minion thing supposed to work? Stramos ground his teeth. I don't know. I've never had a minion before. Mosul spread his hands. Me either. And that was the problem. Stramos didn't know if he'd even done this right. Maybe it took more than a bit of his darkness to create a minion. But there had to be a way to use that bit of himself he'd implanted in them. Stramos pushed off the wall and headed back the way they'd come. Where were Metron and his friends headed? The foursome must be climbing a staircase because they were ascending. Would they go after Sarn again? Stramos slipped into the shadows to think. You did show him where Sarn lives, Mosul reminded him. Maybe they're looking for his flat. Did you give them precise instructions? Stramos tried to remember what he'd done last week and shrugged. I don't know how much information passed to them. They might have just received an image. Stramos shrugged. Could they find his door that way? Mosul asked. I don't know. Stramos had intended to lead them to Sarn's place and use them to flush him and his son out since people who had no magic could knock on his door without the spells on it muffling them. But he no longer needed them for that since Sarn was out and about with his son. I need to know what Metron and his friends are planning. Stramos closed his eyes and tried to connect with Valen instead, but nothing happened. Damn it. Before he could try again with one of Metron's other friends, they split up. Where were they going? This was so infuriating. Stramos resisted the urge to tear his hair out. Where are they going? Mosul pointed at the two dots moving away from Metron and Valen's dots. But Stramos didn't have a map in his head, just 4 glowing dots and a lot of darkness. I don't know, but I hope they're looking for Sarn's flat. Stramos jogged back to it just in case. Maybe he could help Metron find it. Sarn wouldn't see that coming, not with that boy distracting him, and Stramos couldn't wait to see what would happen when Sarn and Metron clashed again. But first, he needed to find Metron. How do you know Metron will accost him? Mosul asked. I don't know if he will. But Stramos hoped he would, and he could probably convince Metron to, since a little of his darkness now lurked in the back of Metron's mind, and it grew stronger as the distance between them shrank. Stramos almost shouted with joy. Metron must be headed to Sarn's flat for another confrontation. Stramos willed him to find it. Are you sure that's a good idea? Mosul backed away from the passenger seat in their mind. No, but I need to know what Sarn will do. It might tell Stramos how to trap a mage, and that thought put a skip in his step. Chapter 3. I need to talk to you. Rand's question had broken the spell over them, and they'd proceeded to the kitchen and had cookies and milk. Somehow it wasn't awkward or weird. Inari had relaxed enough to pull out a deck of cards and shuffle it, but she didn't deal any cards. Thank God Rand talked non-stop. He answered all Ranispara's questions, but Ran also ate way too many cookies before Sarn noticed and slid the jar away from him. That wasn't good parenting. Sarn bit the inside of his lip and hoped no one else noticed how many cookies Ran had enjoyed. The little imp would have kept eating them too if Sarn hadn't stopped him. Sarn, Inari gestured to the balcony. Can I have a word with you? All right. Sarn rose and Ran reached for the cookie jar. No, you've had enough. If you keep eating those, you'll never sleep. And Murren would never forgive him for that. I just need 2 for Uncle Murren. I won't eat anymore. Ran held up 2 fingers. Okay, but only take 2 for him and wrap them in. Sarn glanced around, but he didn't see anything to put the cookies in. I'll put them in my pocket. They'll be safe there. Ran grinned and tried to look like he had no designs on those cookies by widening his eyes. Sarn doubted that, but he couldn't think of a better option. Here. Put them in this. Inari produced a clean towel. You can return it next Friday. Okay. Ran took the towel and laid it on the table. Just take 2 cookies and wrap them up for Murren and no more, Sarn reminded him. Okay. Ran reached into the jar. I'll watch him. You go have that chat and then I'll walk you out. Ranispara winked. Sarn knew when to quit, so he pulled open the balcony door and stepped out. What did you want to talk about? Inari patted the bench next to her. Sit. I'll stand. All I do is lay about and work magic. Sarn folded his arms. I won't apologize for inviting her. She's my best friend, and I couldn't keep this from her. Inari shuffled the deck of cards in her hands. I know. I'm sorry I put you in this situation. I just want to keep him safe. But Sarn didn't know if he could keep his son safe for much longer, not if Ran kept talking to strangers. One day, that habit would get his son into trouble. I just hope I'm there to save him when it does. Is that all you wanted to talk about? No. You can't keep this from my husband, and it isn't fair to ask me to. You need to tell him about your son. He'll be mad and hurt that you didn't trust him, but in the end he'll understand. He's a father too. Inari drew a card, but she didn't look at it. Hi Sarn. Neril sat up. He'd been lying in the sun reading, but the sun was setting. Can I go inside now? Yes. Sarn didn't think it mattered anymore if Nirul saw his son. Everything was coming full circle anyway, since he used to babysit Nirul when the boy was Rand's age. I have the cookies for Uncle Murren and some for you because you didn't have any, Rand said through the kitchen window. Tell Murren I said hi. Nirul picked up his book. How do you know my uncle? Rand flung open the door to the balcony. I see him at school. We're not in the same class, but we're both in the library, and sometimes we talk. Nirul shrugged. Who are you? Rand pointed at Nirul. I'm Nirul. I live here with my parents. He waved to Inari. Oh. I'm Rand. He's my papa. You won't tell anyone, right? Rand squinted at him. Who would I tell? Your uncle already knows about you. Nirul rose. That's true. He promised to read me an extra story if I brought him 2 cookies. Rand raised a towel-wrapped parcel as the bells of Mount Eredrin rang. He counted their peals on his fingers and announced the hour. 17. We should go. Uncle Murren only needed an hour to finish his homework. It was nice meeting you all, but we have to go now. Rand waved and padded toward the outer door. I'd better go. It was good to see you again, Nirul. Sarn pushed off the rock wall he'd been leaning against. You too. Nirul waved. Think about what I said. Inari shuffled the deck again. I will. Sarn pulled the door open and almost crashed into Ranaspara in the kitchen. He's such a little darling, especially when he quotes you. Ranaspara squeezed his arm. Don't worry. Your secret's safe with me. She released him. Thank you. There was a lump in his throat, preventing him from saying more. Sarn hurried to the outer door and reached it just as Rand stood on tiptoe and turned the knob. The door swung in, and he backed away, giving Sarn enough time to stick his head out and check that the hallway was empty. It was. His shoulders slumped in relief. Bye-bye, everyone. I'll see you next week. Rand waved again, then slipped through the gap before Sarn could stop him. Rand, wait for me. Sarn strode after him. I can't. We only have 3 hours until you have to go to work. Uncle Murren has to read me a story, and I want to meet more of your work friends. That'll be a nice adventure. Rand skipped to the next intersection. My what? Sarn caught up to him and stepped in front of his son. Your work friends. Where do I go to meet them? I want to meet all the people you work with, so when you tell me stories, I can put faces to their names. Rand leaned around him and scanned the intersection. Which way, Papa? Let's go that way. Sarn waved to the hallway in front of them. That way leads to Nulthur's place. Are your work friends coming over tonight? Rand bounced on his toes. No, they weren't. How do I get into these situations? Had Ranaspara put Ran up to this? Sarn sought a reason for them to head back to the dubious safety of Nulthur's flat. You promised to bring my brother some cookies. Shouldn't we drop them off first? Yes, adventures are a hungry business. Let's go. Ran raced ahead. Sarn hurried after him. Wait, Ran, don't run. Thank God he had longer legs than his son. He caught up to the boy, and this time he caught Rand's hand so he couldn't run off again. Sorry. I have a lot to do, and not enough time. Rand grinned up at him. You still need to be careful, and please stop talking to strangers. Sarn scanned the hallway. What are strangers? I know you told me, but I forgot. Rand tapped his heels on the stone floor. Anyone you don't know is a stranger. Sarn sighed. He'd only told his son that 100 times. How many more times would he have to say it before it sank in? What if you know them? Is that person a stranger? Rand swung the parcel in his other hand. Yes. Sarn rubbed the bridge of his nose. A tension headache throbbed behind his eyes. It would go away if he relaxed, but he couldn't, not after what just happened. You don't want me to talk to anyone? Ran kicked a warrior statue as they passed it. That was true. But talking to strangers could be dangerous for such a young child. How could he make his son understand? Sarn searched for a reason as they passed a potted plant. In the green glow of his eyes, it cast a long shadow over Ran. Sarn shuddered, then reminded himself why it was so dark here. He hadn't relit the Lumiere crystal mosaic in this part of the mountain yet, so all the light in it came from his eyes right now. Stop seeing things in the shadows. It's okay, Papa. Ran patted his hand. You don't like to talk to people, but I do. So when we meet people, let me do all the talking. Okay. Ran glanced up at him for confirmation. No. Sarn covered his face with his free hand. He'd gone wrong somewhere with this explanation, and now Ran had the wrong idea about everything. It's not like that. Yes, it is. But that's okay. Not everyone likes talking to people. Ran swung their clasped hands. Voices echoed in the hallway aside from theirs before Sarn could argue the point, and he tensed for a whole new reason. Someone was coming, but from which direction? Is trouble coming? Ran stopped, and Sarn almost walked into his son. Maybe. But we're almost there. Sarn gave his son a gentle shove toward Nulthur's door. It opened when Ran touched the rune next to the handle, but the boy glanced over his shoulder instead of entering. Sarn shoved him inside and shut the door as Metron and a man he didn't recognize stepped out of the shadows. Chapter 4. Shadows on the Heart. Well, that was interesting. Ranispara collapsed on the couch after the door closed. Were you planning this last week when I brought you news of the rider? Yes. You're my best friend. We have no secrets from each other. Inari saw no reason not to admit that since it was the truth. Nor did she regret it. Sarn had brought this on himself. He and his adorable son had left, but their presence lingered like shadows on the rug. No, we don't. But I feel bad. He went to such lengths to keep that sunny boy a secret, and I ripped that away. Ranispara shook her head. I know, and it boggles my mind. Inari dropped onto the couch across from her, and all the tension that had built up for over a week since she'd found out about the boy drained out of her. I needed this. It was so cathartic to get all this out in the open. So why did she keep seeing Sarn collapse on the couch like a house of cards falling to pieces? When his son saw how distressed he was, Ran had extracted the same promise from Ranispara that his father had from her, all without batting an eye. Inari rubbed her temples. Now Ranispara was caught in this web of deception too. How could they expose it? I think I made things worse. Inari bit her lip to keep from screaming in frustration. How so? Ranispara tossed her braid over her shoulder. Didn't she see the problem? Inari smoothed her skirt. You promised Ran you wouldn't tell anyone about him. Yeah, I did. I want to know more about his situation before I do anything about him. He seemed well cared for, and Sarn obviously adores him. Ranispara really didn't get it. Because you promised him, you can't talk about his son to someone who doesn't know he exists. His magic won't let you. Inari rose and paced. I doubt that. He's just a little kid. Ranispara waved like her words were smoke, and she could clear them away if she waved her hand back and forth fast enough. But they weren't smoke. They were magic, and once cast, a spell couldn't be dispelled that way. Sarn is more powerful than you know. Inari clenched her fists as she paced. I know he's powerful, but his magic only works on rocks. And his son will get his magic from him, so it'll work the same way. Ranispara leaned back in her seat. If that's true, then why can't Sarn lie? If his magic only works on rocks, then it shouldn't care what he says. But it cares so much, it won't let him say anything that isn't true. Inari stopped and faced her friend. You might be right. What does that have to do with us? Ranaspara folded her arms. I couldn't talk about his son with anyone other than him until you found out about the boy. Inari dropped onto the couch again and put her head in her hands. This was getting her nowhere fast. Really? That's hard to believe, but you've never lied to me. Ranaspara rose and circled the two couches as she tapped her chin and thought for a moment, then stopped. One thing perplexes me still. How did he keep the boy a secret for so long? I remember what he was like at 16, which must be around the time Ran was born. Sarn didn't trust anyone except Murren, but Murren was only 10 then. So how much could he tell him? What was he like then? I didn't see him much, but you saw him every day. Yeah. I worked with him a lot then. In those days he was silent, depressed, angry, and in desperate need of a father figure. God bless your husband for taking him on and filling that need. Sarn's come a long way since then. Ranaspara sat on the couch again, but her brown eyes were looking at the past, not the door to the bedroom behind them. Murren couldn't have helped him hide Ran because he was just a kid then. So who helped him? Inari fluffed the throw pillow next to her just to do something, even if that wouldn't help Sarn or his situation. You made it nearly impossible for me to help you. Damn him for that. He probably got help from the boy's mother. Ran didn't spring fully formed into being. Someone had to give birth to him. Ranaspara mimed a pregnant belly. Did you ask about her? No, I didn't think of it. But Inari should have because she was a mother too. Her son had retired to his room, which was off the living room, and closed the door, giving them the illusion of privacy, but he could hear every word. Maybe he was her way out of this. No one had forbidden Nirul to talk about Ran. My son could tell his father. But as soon as she'd thought that, Inari knew that was wrong. The truth must come from Sarn. Somehow, I must convince him to tell my husband. But that might take a miracle to happen. Inari sighed. This was making her head spin. Inari rested her hand on her skirt pocket, and her tarot cards shifted. They probably had a lot to say. Did she want to hear it? She'd stayed away from them after their last reading. But they couldn't make things worse. Are you doing another reading? Ranaspara rubbed her hands together. Should I? Inari pulled out her tarot cards and stared at them. Hell yes. Start dealing and interpreting. I want to know what they know. Ranaspara pointed at the deck. Inari ran her thumb over the topmost card, then flipped it over to reveal the world card, and it was upside down. That didn't bode well. Well, what does that card mean? Ranaspara reached for it. It means something is undone, missing, or incomplete. Inari stared at the blue-green sphere and the upside-down woman superimposed on it. What did that card mean for the question uppermost in her mind? Was Ran's mother missing? Did they not have closure? These were questions she should put to Sarn when his son wasn't in the room. Inari flipped the card over and stacked it on the deck. I don't think we'll find any answers in here. She shoved the deck into her pocket and rose. Have you eaten something other than cookies today? Yes, but I'd planned to grab a sandwich on my way back. Since I came up here on my lunch break, I should probably head back. Unless you need me for something else. Ranaspara rose too. She wore her greens, but most rangers wore them even if they weren't working. I can do better than that. Come on. Inari strode through the living room to the kitchen and was glad to have something constructive to do. Nirul, do you want anything to eat? No, I had a snack already, he called from his bedroom. I guess it's just us. Are you sure it's no trouble? Because I can just stop at the first place I pass. Ranaspara waved to the outer door. It's no trouble. Come on. She needed the distraction, but Inari didn't mention that. The cards shifted in her pocket, but she ignored them. I'll ask Sarn next Friday about Ran's mother. That's soon enough. Dread coiled in her gut as she pulled out a loaf of bread and sliced it. I have a feeling I won't like the answer. But she must ask the question. Chapter 5. I want to see him. What do you want? Sarn leaned against the door and tried to remember which rune would lock it. Was it the one shaped like a skeleton key? I want to see him. Metron glared up at Sarn since the height difference made the reverse impossible. Not that Metron was a short man, but Sarn was taller than everyone he'd ever met. Who do you want to see? But Sarn already knew. Maybe it was the circle rune that locked the door. All the runes thing had shown him swam in his head. Sarn couldn't remember which one was which anymore. How had Metron found him? I want to see Biku's boy. Don't play dumb. Metron folded his arms. Who's he? Sarn nodded to the other man. He was dark-haired with brown eyes, but he was burlier than them both and shorter. I'm Valen. I used to be a foundling too. Valen inclined his head to Sarn, but he didn't move from the wall he leaned against. Muffled voices came through the door. Sarn bet it was his son asking questions. The handle jerked in his hand. Let me bar it, his magic said. Sarn sagged in relief as his earth magic swept out of him and walked around the door, sealing it. No one could get in or out now. Ran was safe. I want to see Biku's son too. Valen studied something in his hand. She and I were lovers too, you know. Valen flashed the knife he held. I don't like metal, his magic said as it swatted the knife out of Valen's hand. Valen stared at the knife on the floor between them. Why did you do that? It wasn't me. My magic doesn't like metal. It reacted before I could stop it. Sarn spread his hands since he no longer needed to hold the door handle. His magic held it closed for him. Ran could plead with it all he wanted, but his magic wouldn't open the door until Sarn told it to. But you don't have a problem with the scaffolding, and it's all metal. Sarn needed clarification because his magic had held that metal thing in place for him earlier without complaint. No, it doesn't have an edge, and it can't hurt you if you don't fall, his earth magic said. Doesn't it bother you she had other lovers? Metron studied him. No, I've met too many people since she left who claimed the same thing. It no longer shocks me. And Sarn was glad she left. We just want to see the boy. Then we'll be on our way. I know he's in there. Metron waved to the door behind Sarn. I heard you talk to him. Why do you want to see him so badly? That didn't make sense to Sarn. Biku had disappeared 2 weeks before Ran's 4th birthday, and that was almost 5 months ago now. Why the sudden interest? Because he might be all that's left of her in this world. Metron's shoulders slumped. Why is that my problem? Sarn didn't ask that aloud. He just stood in front of the door as Ran slapped its other side to get his attention. Thankfully, the thick wood muffled his demands to go out. Sarn wished the boy would realize that he blocked the door for a damn good reason, but the wood probably muffled their conversation. Metron cracked his knuckles. So it was like that now. Sarn hung his head. He hated fighting because someone always got hurt. But he said the words that would start the fight, because it was inevitable. The boy is mine. I don't have to show him to you. Produce the boy. Let me see that for myself. Metron stepped toward him. No. Sarn hoped his magic would hold the door closed if he stepped away from it. If Ran popped out now, that would just worsen things. If you don't produce the boy right now, I'll make your life a living hell. And I can do that. Trust me. I'm free and you're not. Metron raised his fists. Sarn laughed at that threat. He was in hell already. He collapsed against the door as waves of mirth rolled through him, leaving him short of breath until he sobered. You think my life has been easy? I could make it worse. Metron rolled his head to one side and shook out his shoulders. Or I could make it better. I said no. Get out of here before someone notices and calls the guards. You don't belong here. Sarn squared his shoulders. Metrin shook his head. Not until I see the boy. He's my son. You don't need to see him. Sarn folded his arms. Yes, I do. I just want to see for myself that he's yours. She had other lovers besides you when he was conceived. Metrin widened his stance. That accusation would have cut deep months ago, but not now. I know. But that doesn't matter. Yesterday's gone. It has no bearing on today. I've raised him for almost 5 years, not you. He's my son. Sarn meant it too. His own past no longer lingered near the surface. In fact, he hadn't thought of anything that had happened before he'd destroyed the Age-Eldar. Sarn had been living in the present, not the past, and making something of it, and that was due to his sister. Thank you, Sovan. I hope we can sit and talk again soon. I have so much to tell you, and there's so much I want to know about you. We will, bro, she said through their bond. It should matter. Look, I just want to see the boy and make sure he's yours. Metrin extended his hand like a peace offering, but it wouldn't end there. I just want to make sure he's yours. Metrin's words echoed in Sarn's skull, and they sounded more ominous with each repetition as his magic flowed back into him, leaving the door unprotected. No, Ran is my son, Sarn told that voice. There was a little light in my head, and it led me to you, Ran said last week. Didn't that prove Ran was his son? I know you don't want to hear this, but she slept with Valen too around then. Metrin spread his hands. So the boy might be mine or his or yours. Let him out, and we'll see. He's mine. Sarn was tired of arguing. Maybe this once, it would be okay to give in to their demands. Let me see that for myself. Metrin took a step toward Sarn and swung a fist at him. Sarn dodged but kept his hand on the knob to prevent it from opening as Valen's fist plowed into his belly. Everything blurred together as Metrin tried to pry him away from the door. Sarn didn't bother to hit back. He must keep that door shut. That was his primary objective. He called his magic, but it didn't come. Why aren't you helping me? You don't want us to hurt anyone, and we can't avoid that in a fight, said his magic. Then hold the door closed. Sarn strained to hold it, but both Valen and Metrin had given up on hitting him. Both had grabbed his arms and pulled. If they broke his grip, the door would open. Why does everything have to come down to violence with you? Metrin grunted as he tried to squeeze between Sarn and the door. The scuffle had downgraded from a fistfight to a tangle of thrusting knees, jabbing elbows and fingers wedging themselves between Sarn and the door. Metrin had hooked one foot around Sarn's ankle. The question startled Sarn enough that Metrin finally swept his foot out from under him. Sarn's balance wavered, and Metrin threw himself against him, and his greater weight bore them both to the ground. Sarn thrashed. He must get back to the door and keep it closed. Will you quit that? The fight's over. I won and you lost. Produce the boy. Metrin slapped Sarn hard enough to snap his head back. But his magic rushed to protect him, and the floor softened, so Sarn didn't crack his skull open. Now you help me. If you're hurt, then you can't use us, said his magic as it seeped back into his head. That was true. Sarn shoved Metrin off him as the door swung open, and Ran popped out. Why did you bar the door? Ran skidded to a halt as his eyes bounced from Metrin on the ground to Sarn. Oh. Ran fell back a step and bumped into his uncle. What's going on out here? Murren rested a hand on Ran's shoulder, and Ran leaned into him. They're bad men. Ran pointed to Metrin and Valen. Yes, they are. Sarn rose and stepped over Metrin to put himself between his son and the two men who'd fought to see him. Ran peered around Sarn's legs as Metrin sat up and shook his head. When he swiveled around to face Sarn, he could only see Ran's small hands gripping his pant leg. The boy had ducked behind Sarn and under his cloak. As a shiver passed through Ran, he pressed against Sarn's leg. I didn't come to hurt the boy. I would never do that. Tell him to come out. Metrin's dark eyes had softened, and he waved to the boy. Against Sarn's better judgment, he yielded to the plea in his voice. It would be better if Metron saw for himself the truth of things. Come out, Ran. It's okay now. No one will hurt you. Or you. Ran let go of his pants and took his hand as he stood next to Sarn. Ran looked up at him, and his green eyes begged Sarn to pick him up. So Sarn did, and Ran clung to him. Metron had gained his feet by now, and he sucked in a shocked breath at the sight of Ran. My God. You weren't kidding. He looks just like you. He's my son. Sarn held the boy against his heart, and Ran laid his head in the hollow between his neck and shoulder. How is that even possible? You were 15, and I was 20 at the time. How could you possibly be his father? Metron ripped out some of his hair. It doesn't matter. Sarn didn't understand it either, even though the healer had explained the facts of life to him the day after Ran was born. The conversation had been about 2 years too late, but at least he now knew where babies came from. Metron let his shoulders slump in defeat. I guess it doesn't after all. You should go before someone reports the fight to the guards. They live in the apartments around here. Murren waved to them. Metron nodded, but instead of leaving, he closed the distance. Sarn backed up and twisted, so the man couldn't catch hold of his son. He realized too late that Metron wasn't after Ran. Metron clamped a hand around the back of Sarn's neck and pulled his head down. His other hand seized his chin, so Sarn couldn't turn his head or look away. Metron stared into his glowing eyes until Sarn jerked free. His shoulders crashed into the door as he sought to evade any further contact. Why did you do that? Metron shook his head, but his troubled gaze fixed on the rough wooden planks behind Sarn. I know what she saw in you. I get it now. Metron licked his lips. What are you talking about? Sarn could only stare at him. I know why she left me for you. Metron shrank into himself as that strangled whisper hung in the air between them. He crossed his arms over his chest to protect his heart. She was mine. Then I came home one night, and she wouldn't see me. I got the door open, and you were asleep under her furs. Your face was swollen with bruises, but I could tell it was you. Your brother curled up with you, so I knew nothing had happened yet, but she'd made her choice. She wanted you, and she'd have you any way she could get you. Metron stared at Sarn, but his eyes were hollow pits until he blinked. His arms fell back to his sides, and he straightened. I expected her to tire of you and leave you just like she left me. He sighed. I guess she did in the end. I saw her that morning. Metron shook his head, and his gaze turned inward to that fateful day. Which morning? Sarn asked, but he already knew, and he didn't want to hear it. Baku had left, end of story. Go away. You've seen what you needed to. Sarn stepped inside, and Murren scrambled to get out of the way. He'd heard enough. Don't you want to hear what happened next? Metron asked, but he didn't follow them. No, I don't want to hear anything else. Sarn shut the door behind him. Is he talking about Mama? Ran squirmed in his arms. Yes, but he doesn't know anything. He'll just lie to us. Murren sat on the wooden chair flanking a table covered in books. Why? Ran glanced between them for an answer. Because that's what bad people do. Murren stacked 2 books on top of the others. That was true. How about that story? Did you give Murren the cookies you brought him? Sarn would take any distraction right now, but the owlcats weren't around. Not even Furball, and that was strange. Things should have butted into the fight. But he hadn't, and that wasn't like him. Where are the owlcats? I don't know. They flew out of the window a while ago, but they didn't say where they were going, or why they were leaving. Murren shrugged. They all left, even Furball? Ran glanced around for his friend. Yeah, him too. Don't worry. We'll interrogate them when they return. Murren winked. It wouldn't take much. Thing liked to talk, but Sarn didn't say that aloud. How about that story? Then I need to run an errand. Sarn set his son down. What errand? Murrin studied him. I just need to check something. That's all. Sarn unrolled their bedroll. But Murrin didn't buy that until Sarn hugged Ran and mouthed, not in front of him. We'll talk later. Murrin nodded. Sure. Don't forget to tell me how it all turns out. I won't. Ran, why don't you tell Murrin about our visit with Inari? It was quite eventful. And that was an understatement. Sarn hoped there wouldn't be a repeat in the future. But that did the trick. Ran started talking and didn't stop when Sarn let go. But he pointed down, then to the door, and waited for Murrin's nod to go. If all went well, he'd return in an hour with a solution to his latest problem: how to get his family far away from Metron. There was only one solution he could think of, and it meant descending to the lower quarters, a place Sarn had avoided for over a month now since defeating the Ageldar. But he had nowhere else to go except down there. Metron wouldn't look for him or his son in the lower quarters. Or would he? Sarn stopped on a staircase that spiraled into darkness beyond the glow of his green eyes. Did Metron know where the foundlings lived? Did they still live in a cave 100 feet down from his cave? Had they all survived the Aegalder's tentacles, the adversary's summons, the impenetrable darkness when the Lumiere crystals went out, and the riots he'd heard rumors about? Metron hadn't said, and he didn't want to ask him. So there was only one way to find out. Sarn steeled himself and descended until someone called his name. Chapter 6. A New Plan. Well, that didn't go how he'd expected, but it wasn't as bad as it could have been. And Stramos had learned some interesting things, like Sarn couldn't fight to save his life. And he hadn't used magic against Metron or Valen either. Now that was interesting. Why hadn't he used magic? Had all the relighting of the Lumiere crystals used up so much of his magic that he couldn't use it for anything else? If so, that would be good for what Stramos was planning. You don't know why he didn't use it. It might not be because he's running out of magic. Mosul just had to burst his bubble. That was true, but Sarn had used magic to hold the door closed until that spell disappeared. Could Sarn cast spells and fight at the same time? Because it hadn't seemed like he could, but they needed more information. Unfortunately, he wouldn't get it because Metron and Valen wouldn't attack Sarn again unless the odds were stacked in their favor. Stramos followed the duo to where they were supposed to rendezvous with their friends and hid behind a statue. What will you do now? Mosul asked. I'll tell them my plan. His plan still lacked some crucial details, but Stramos ignored that as he rounded the statue. He'd figure out the rest later. I'll make him pay for that. Valen slammed a fist into his palm. We all will. Metron clapped a hand on Valen's shoulder. And I'll help you. Stramos stepped out of the shadows into the light of their Lumiere crystals. How? You weren't much help the last time. You tied us up. Valen stabbed his index finger into Stramos' chest. That was Mosul, not him, but they didn't know about Mosul. Stramos ignored the comment. But I've got a secret weapon Sarn can't fight. Stramos grinned and didn't care if he looked demented. What is it? Metron let his hand fall back to his side. Come with me, and I'll show you. Stramos headed for the nearest stairwell down to the lower quarters and the prison. It was time he visited the one person Sarn couldn't disobey. That would counteract any magic Sarn might use if the mage tried to use any at all, and render him harmless since Sarn couldn't fight either. Such a shame. Sarn had all that power and no idea how to use it effectively. Stramos couldn't believe the mage hadn't thrown a single punch. Not everyone is a fighter, Mosul reminded him. That was true, but if Sarn couldn't use magic in a fight, then he had only one option: to call his sister. Stramos smiled. But Sarn wasn't the only person who could call Sovan. His son had summoned her the other day. Stramos ground his teeth at the thought of the little boy. He didn't like children. And snatching the boy would raise memories from his own childhood, when a group of demon summoners had caught and imprisoned him. I'll hold the kid in reserve. But must he grab that child himself? Maybe he could leave the capture and imprisonment of the little one to someone who didn't have his emotional baggage. But could these four capture the kid when he was rarely ever outside that warded flat without Sarn? Forget the kid. Leave him out of this, Mosul begged. All right. Stramos put the kid out of mind, and a weight lifted from his chest. He's lying. There's only one person Sarn must obey, and he's dead. Come on. Metron waved for his cronies to follow him as the bells tolled the hour. He's not dead. Stramos spun his cane, and its jeweled grip caught the light of the Lumiere crystal mosaic overhead. Liar. We saw his execution. Valen stepped into the stairwell and headed down. He probably headed to the lower quarters again, and his friends followed him without a backward glance except for the woman. Larissa glared at Stramos. Can you prove he's alive? Not here, but if you'll come with me, I will. Stramos headed for the staircase where Metron and his friends had gone. Yeah, right. I wasn't born yesterday. I won't go anywhere with you ever again. She shook her head. Larissa, are you coming? Her friends asked from the stairwell. Yeah, I'm coming. She strode into the stairwell and stomped down the steps after her friends. Well, that hadn't gone well. Stramos rubbed his chin. Where did I go wrong? I showed them where to find Sarn. It wasn't his fault they'd screwed up that meeting, and he still didn't know how they'd hidden from him for a week. Maybe they'd tell him. Where were you last week? Away from you. Larissa's voice echoed in the stairwell. They won't tell you. Not after you knocked them out and I tied them up. Mosul spread his transparent hands. Will they go back there now to escape me? Stramos doubted Sarn would leave his flat again tonight. Maybe he could follow Larissa back to what had blocked his senses. But what good would that do? Metron wouldn't work with him, and neither would his friends. Stramos stared at the shadowed steps beyond the portal, then shrugged. Perhaps he should return to his original plan and give up on Metron. I only need one minion. It was time he fetched Hadroval. Where did you put that man after you liberated him and made me forget he still exists? How had Mosul taken those memories anyway? Stramos entered the dark spiral staircase that wound through the mountain. It was one of 50 such staircases that linked the underground levels. He almost tripped when he realized how much of the lower quarters he'd searched last week. Well, I know where Hadroval isn't. And there was only one place he hadn't gone, the prison. But he kept that thought to himself. Where do you think? Mosul turned away inside their mind and dropped a cloak over his thoughts. Clever. Did the old summoner have some mind magic? Did you put him back in the oubliette? Stramos frowned because that didn't make sense. Vanya and her minions had destroyed it, so Mosul must have stashed Hadroval somewhere in the rest of the prison. What better place to hide Hadroval than in plain sight in the prison? Maybe I did, or maybe he finally fled. Mosul still wouldn't relax. His spirit hunched his shoulders. I don't think he can leave, not while he's tied to Sarn. Stramos trudged down the stairs in the darkness and relied on his demon-enhanced eyes to warn him of trip hazards. But the question remained. If he couldn't make proper minions out of 4 annoying humans, how would he succeed with Hadroval? You're not angry with me over this? Mosul stared at him, aghast. No, you've made your feelings about my plans quite clear. I'll find Hadroval on my own. Stramos had tasted that man's soul, and it was as dark as his own. That should give him an advantage, and Stramos liked to hunt. The beast pacing in his soul wanted to come out and play too. Don't let it out. You've killed too many people under its influence. Mosul touched his soul and shoved the beast down. Stramos tripped and tumbled down the steps until he grabbed a carving on the wall enclosing the stairs. He'd never been so glad the Lithirians had decorated this place too. His heart thundered in his ears as he rose on unsteady legs and winced. Stramos pulled on his magic to heal a cracked rib. It took more magic to keep this old body young and healthy, but it was his home. "Are you all right?" Mosul retracted his hand. "I don't know." Stramos sat on a step and rubbed his face. The staircase spun around him. But he must get up. He'd almost reached the lower quarters, and the oubliette was somewhere on that level. Stramos rose and tottered down the remaining stairs. He left the staircase through another portal, but this one didn't have any decorative carvings. "Don't do this." Mosul extended his spirit again, but Stramos dodged. He didn't know how he'd lure Sarn down here without revealing Hadroval. "I might have to grab that kid after all." Stramos ground his teeth and hoped a better plan came to mind. Just thinking about that kid made him uneasy. But he would do it to catch Sovan, so he could punish her for hurting them. After all, a wound to this body hurt not just him but Mosul too, and that was unacceptable. Sovan would pay for that, and Sarn too, because he was everything Stramos could have been if demon summoners hadn't raised him. Mosul had done his best to shield him from his fellow black magic practitioners' abuse, but Stramos didn't want to think about that now. He needed to find Hadroval and overshadow him, then lay a trap to catch a mage. Chapter 7. Don't drop your guard. Don't drop your guard. Arain threw another punch at him and smiled. She loved a good fight. That's why she joined the guards, and she made a great teacher when she wasn't beating the tar out of everyone she sparred with. Why did I agree to this? Nulthar got both fists up to defend his head, and her gloved fists bounced off his leather gauntlets. Arain danced out of range and clapped her hands, but her leather gauntlets absorbed most of the sound. Good. Do you see what he did? Use your armor if you have any to absorb blows. That's what it's there for. But don't leave yourself open for an attack like he did. Arain turned to regard their audience, a group of young men and women who'd signed up to become guards. Nulthar pulled off a gauntlet so he could rub the sweat from his eyes. If you'd caught me when I was fresher, I wouldn't have dropped my guard. That's no excuse. We're not always at our best when duty calls. Arain waved that excuse away, and her dark eyes laughed at him. She wasn't at all sorry for beating up on her friend and captain. I should make her my second. She'd be great at it. That sounded like the right amount of payback to Nulthar, and he grinned at the idea. She'd hate you for it, Thing said, but the owlcat didn't appear. He was right. Arain had threatened to quit the last time he'd mentioned that. But it was so tempting. That's why we train. Now everyone, break up into pairs and practice the sequence we just showed you. Arain waved to the trainees standing around the training room. Does that include me, or can I sit this one out? Nulthar pulled off his other gauntlet while the trainees stepped onto the mats. I don't know. Do you need more practice? You dropped your guard a few times, and that could be fatal in a fight. Arain squinted at him as she tucked a thin braid back under the blue scarf she'd covered her hair with. I'm still here, aren't I? Nulthar spread his arms to prove it. Her scarf matched her uniform so well that he wondered where she'd found it, and if the weaver could make a thicker version. It would be nice to have a scarf that didn't clash with his uniform this winter. Today you are. Tomorrow you might not be. Maybe you should practice a bit more. Arain laughed when he scowled. Thank God there were no mirrors in this chamber. Their old practice room had a wall of them, but a monster with extra long tentacles destroyed it a few weeks ago. Nulthar still hadn't cobbled together enough funds to replace those mirrors yet, so the new training room had none. He was probably a sorry sight right now with his blue uniform matted with sweat and dirt, because he hadn't sat behind a desk all day like some people. Too many of the administrators hid in their apartments or their offices, waiting for the trouble to subside, and it would, eventually. But not before everyone had a source of light and heat again, and that might take a while since they only had one mage who could provide that. Next time I'll join you. Nulthar headed for the door while Arain tried to rein in her laughter. Hold up. I need a moment. Arain jogged over before he reached the door. Sure. What's on your mind? Hopefully not more sparring. Nulthur didn't have the energy for that right now. It would help if he could grab more than a few hours of sleep in a row. Arain worked just as much as he did, but somehow she always looked fully rested. Maybe she could function on less sleep than he could, or her dark skin didn't show every lost hour of sleep the way his pallor did. The former was probably true because her dark eyes sparkled like sunlight on a sword with mischief. Nulthur didn't envy those recruits. They had a couple of hours until Arain dismissed them. I should get out of here before she drafts me for another lesson. He turned to go. I just wanted to let you know that I'm planning a surprise inspection later tonight. Arain rubbed her gloved hands together like she hoped there'd be trouble. I hope there's no trouble in the prison tonight. Because that was what Arain planned to inspect. Nulthur rubbed the back of his neck as he turned back to her to soothe the ache in it. That's a good idea, but why tonight? Because tonight's a good night for it. She pounded a fist into her gloved hand. Trust me on that. I do. Tonight sounds like a great time for that. And there was still one escaped prisoner at large. Thoughts of Hadroval depressed Nulthur, and his shoulders bowed under the weight of his failure to recapture that menace. Arain nodded because she knew what he was thinking. He should have turned up by now. And that got me thinking. He must have had help to escape. I know it's been a few months, but it can't hurt to drop a question or two and see what turns up. Maybe someone will remember something. She shrugged. Maybe. I hope you jog something loose. We need to recapture him before he gets into trouble. But it might already be too late for that since Hadroval had escaped months ago. He might not even be under the mountain anymore. But Nulthur banished that thought before it could depress him any further. He'd never stopped looking for Hadroval, but the search had turned up nothing so far. Not even a whisper. We'll find him. Arain patted his shoulder. I'd better get back in there and whip those trainees into shape. I'd wish you good luck, but you don't need it. Nulthur tucked his gauntlets under his belt so they could hang there until needed. Quite true. But they might. Arain waved to the trainees. They swung at each other, but not with any intent to land a blow. Arain rolled her eyes and jogged over to the first pair of fighters. Oh, come on. I've seen cats fight better than you. Hit him like you mean it so he learns how to block, then switch so you learn the same lesson. Nulthur strode away before Arain could pull him into the lesson. But he stopped when Thing flew around a warrior statue and hovered in front of the statue's sword. There's still no sign of him. Thing fixed his golden eyes on him. His friend was half owl from head to waist and furry from somewhere in the middle to his clawed feet. Thing swished his prehensile tail like a cat. None, and that worries me. Nulthur walked away from the new practice room. Because if Hadroval ever found out about Sarn, he'd go after the mage, and Sarn didn't need that. But Nulthur didn't want to admit that aloud, and give fate any ideas. Sarn had enough problems right now just relighting the mountain. I think he's already gone after Sarn, not recently but in the past. Thing folded his furry arms. When? Nulthur stopped and stared at his longtime friend. And once again, he was glad Thing was so nosy. I don't know. During that incident with the Ageldar a few weeks ago, I glimpsed it. But I couldn't get much more because Gerlo put all thoughts of that man out of mind, and we had larger problems then. Thing threw his hands in the air. Well, that was inconvenient. Nulthur didn't know what to say. Thing usually had all the answers. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. And I can't question him since Gerlo's on vacation. Well, you can't right now anyway because he's still recovering from that ill-fated and ill-timed dive into a portal. God, I still can't believe he did that. He hates magic. Thing chortled and slapped his furry belly. He's still recovering from that. Didn't he crash into that thing last week? Nulthur rounded the warrior statue and the 5 statues behind it. He didn't understand why a race of stone mages would spend so much time and resources to carve an army of statues inside their stronghold, but they weren't around to ask about that either. So he wove through the statues, interfering with his commute back to his office. Mount Eredron would be a lot easier to get around if management would remove most of the statues and put them somewhere out of the way, instead of leaving them in the middle of every single hallway. But no one had ever tried to move them. Everyone just ignored them and the dust covering the statues' heads. Either that or he's plotting something. Thing winked, then flew out of the way. Well, which is it? Don't tell me you haven't read his mind. Nulthar leaned against the statue. Paperwork could wait. This was more interesting. No, I haven't. I don't snoop all the time. Thing flew around the bend. I don't believe it. Tell me what you found in his mind. Nulthar rubbed the muscles on the back of his neck. Not a thing because I haven't looked. Don't look at me like that. His mind is weird, and I haven't had a good reason to dive into it, Thing said, but he didn't fly back to him. How do you know what look I'm giving you? Nulthar shook his head and followed his friend. Because I'm always in your mind. But I'm not always in anyone else's. Thing hovered by the next intersection and tapped his head. Then it's a good thing I don't mind. But Nulthar had lost the point of this conversation somewhere. We were talking about Hadroval. You might need to ask Gerlo about his history with Sarn because there's a story there, and we need to know it. Thing sent an image of the commander of the Rangers like he needed a visual. I don't want to talk to him until I must. Can't you pry his secrets out of him? Nulthar couldn't believe his friend was shying away from that. I could, but I don't want to. His mind is a weird place. Thing didn't usually repeat himself. Gerlo's mind must be quite strange. Fine. I'll ask him when he returns from vacation, not before, but you're coming with me when I do. Nulthar didn't want to know what the commander was doing on his vacation, and he wouldn't find out if he left the man alone for now. It was the coward's way out of this, but he had enough problems on his hands right now. Hopefully, new ones weren't lining up outside his office. They were still several turns away from it, so he couldn't tell. No, it's safe to return to your office for a while. And Sarn's safe enough for now. Things slowed at the next intersection so Nulthar could catch up, even though they were talking mind to mind now. That's true. My flat's warded, and I doubt Hadroval can get past that. Sarn is safe when he's there. Nulthar stifled a yawn that had snuck up on him. Sarn was probably there now since he didn't need to report to Nolo until 20th bell, and there were still a few hours until then. And don't forget me. I'm keeping an eye on him when he's lighting crystals. If Hadroval goes after him, I'll know about it. Thing tapped his feathered head again, and that was comforting too, but Sarn had a larger problem they hadn't figured out how to solve yet. How can someone so young have so much power? It boggled his mind every time Nulthar thought about it. Every mage, no matter how powerful they ended up later in life, all started from the same place. At 7, they gained a connection to their power and could use it on their own. So how had Sarn gone from I can access it to I can cast shields that can withstand giant monsters slamming their tentacles into them? And that wasn't even the most impressive thing Sarn had done with his magic. Just the other day, Ran knocked something over, and Sarn caught it with his magic without even looking and set it back where it was. Murren and Ran hadn't even reacted, like that was an everyday occurrence, and maybe it was. Just because I couldn't do that, doesn't mean it's impossible for other mages. Thing patted his shoulder. While that's true, it doesn't explain why Sarn's so powerful. Nulthar nodded. How are the magic lessons going? Thing gripped his head. Not good. He needs more patience, and I need to know why he has 2 magics. Nulthar nodded. I want to know why too. Cursebreakers are born under curses. What curse is he born under? Shadows shifted as he thought that. Sarn hadn't lit this hallway, so there were a lot of shadows since the dawn rune hanging around his neck had dimmed. It was tired too and in need of a recharge, like its caster. It must be powerful for that gift to be so strong it affects his speech. Thing tapped his beak to make his point. Nulthur shivered as he stepped into a cold spot. I don't know, but we need to find out because his powers will just increase as he ages. Thing landed on the shoulder of a different statue. He's having a hard time now. What will happen after his next birthday? He's turning 21 sometime soon, and his powers will expand. Thing ran both hands through the feathers on top of his head until they stuck out at all angles. We need to know what to expect when that happens. Just thinking about it sent shivers through Nulthur. He could bring down the mountain by accident. He's already got the power for it. And just thinking about that made his hands shake. How much more power would Sarn gain on his next birthday? What would he be capable of? Sarn had so little training, and that training wasn't going well, according to the owlcat muttering to himself. He's not patient, Thing said in between his usual rant about kids today. Since he'd switched to audible speech, Nulthur did too. Are you sure you're not the one being impatient? You're not the most patient owlcat I know. Oh, stop. I have infinite patience when it comes to younglings. Thing waved that away. Yeah, right, but you keep telling yourself that, and maybe one day it'll be true. But that was a worry for another day, because Nulthur couldn't do anything about it today. A long string of tasks and other annoying things filled the rest of his evening. Sarn must take care of himself, and he was quite good at that, just not when it came to magic. And Sarn had other problems too that they hadn't even scratched the surface on. How do you help someone who's been through so much to heal? Thing pointed at him. That's the question, but I don't know the answer. I'm not a healer. And there's a line forming outside your office. You'd better go deal with it. Thing flew off in the opposite direction. Where are you going? Nulthur had hoped for some help with that line of people. To talk to Murren. I'll get him away from his brother and nephew for a little while, and ask some of our questions. I have a feeling they shouldn't wait for Gerlo. Thing sounded so ominous that Nulthur almost turned and followed him. But he couldn't do that until he'd dealt with the people waiting for him. Nulthur turned the last bend instead, and tried not to glare at the line of uniformed guards waiting for him. I guess a nap is out of the question. Thing didn't even respond to that, not even in jest, and just underscored how worried he was about Sarn. I'll relay my findings. You deal with that crowd. Call me if you need me, but give me a half hour to talk to Murren first. Thing must suspect something. That was the only explanation for his abrupt departure, or he lied about not snooping all the time. One at a time. Nulthur held up a hand to silence the dozen people all talking at once. He hoped Thing snooped in everyone's minds. That might be the only way to find the truth before it bit all their backsides. Chapter 8. Homeless. Sarn turned. Was he imagining Will standing there? In case he wasn't, he called out to him. Will, what are you doing here? The same thing you are. I'm headed down to check on the foundlings. I know I should have gone sooner. Will stared at his hands. But Sarn understood. He delayed checking on them too for the same reason. Do you want company, or do you want to check on them alone? Sarn hoped Will wanted company. He didn't want to face this alone, but Murren had to keep Rand busy, so he couldn't come. I'd like that. I wasn't looking forward to going down there by myself, not after the rumors I've heard. Will shuddered. Me either, but Murren needs to watch my son. Sarn had missed his friend. Their last words to each other had been angry ones over the foundlings, of course, but that was moot now. Can we forget about our last argument and pretend it never happened? Will glanced at him, and his soft brown eyes asked for forgiveness. Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. Let's start over. Sarn extended his hand. You and I are a lot alike, and I missed that. Will shook his hand. Me too. Sarn relaxed, and the pain behind his eyes decreased. So aside from relighting all the Lumiere crystals under the mountain, what have you been up to? Will descended beside him. Where do I start? It's been an eventful month. Sarn shoved his hands into his pockets. Start at the beginning and go from there. We've got 240 steps ahead of us. Will waved to the irregularly shaped stairs spiraling into the darkness. But somehow there was enough room for them to take the stairs side by side. But the beginning didn't feel like the right place to start, not after what had just happened. Do you remember Metron? Well, he paid me a visit today. He knows where I'm staying, so I need to move my family. Sarn pounded a fist into the wall enclosing the staircase, but his magic wrapped around his hand before it struck the wall and protected it. It was still cathartic, even though his magic had aborted the punch. I hate to break this to you, but he knows where the foundlings live too. Will stopped on the next landing and relaced his boots. He does? All Sarn's plans crashed and burned around him as he stood on the landing beside his friend. Where could he go? His cave was now off limits because it was 100 feet from the foundling's cave, and Metron too if Will was right, and Sarn didn't have any reason to doubt him. He visited them several times a week before everything went to hell, but never at the same time that your son was there. Will checked his other boot and retied its laces too. They told him about my son. That's why he came looking for me. He wanted to see Ran. But Sarn doubted it would end there. Metron wanted something else from him, but what was it? Are you still going down there? Will straightened and gestured to the stairs. Sarn considered that for a moment, then nodded. He must see this through. He still needed to know what had happened to the foundlings. Murren would want to know, and Ran would ask again, and Sarn needed something to tell them. Yeah, I want to know. So do I. Will threaded his arm through Sarn's, and they descended in silence for a whole flight. Why didn't anyone tell me that Metron was visiting the foundlings? But he meant Will specifically, since they used to talk often before everything went wrong. Sarn didn't want to think about that right now. Biku was gone, and the foundlings might be too. And he just wanted to start over. I wanted to, but Murren asked me not to. He wanted to handle it himself, but I guess he didn't have a chance. Will shrugged. Oh. That wasn't what Sarn had expected him to say, and he didn't know how to take that at first. I need to have a long talk with my brother after this, preferably when Ran's asleep. If only they had another room where they could talk while the boy slept, but that wasn't possible with their current living arrangements. It was time for a subject change. Sarn had other questions that needed answers. What about you? How have you been for the last month? How did you escape the monster and the devil? Will tensed. I worked down by the river, and there was a lot of activity around then, so I ended up working long hours and crashing with the harbor master and his wife in their spare room because I was too tired to hike up the mountain and descend to the lower quarters. But Will was holding something back. Sarn didn't pursue it because the stairs had ended at the portal to the lower quarters, and there was light ahead. Where is that light coming from? The black Lumiere crystals stole the magic from all the other Lumiere crystals in the lower quarters. How could any of them still be glowing? Sarn jogged toward the light. Did you relight any crystals down here? Will ran to keep up with him. No. I haven't come down here since all the Lumiere crystals darkened. Sarn stared at the rock formation. Had the Andori restored their glow? How could they? They liked water, and there was no water around here. Then who had done this? Sarn staggered as the implication struck home. Only someone like him could have relit these stones. That meant there was another mage or someone like Nulthur living in the lower quarters. Hell, there could be lots of magic users hiding down here where no one would look for them. Why didn't they introduce themselves to me? They must know I live here. What's wrong? Will studied him. Nothing is wrong. Everything is right. Sarn led Will away from that cluster of glowing Lumiere crystals. But everything was wrong around the next bend. Nothing looked like it had before the Agildar had remodeled the lower quarters. Someone had removed some of the debris, but it was still a tight squeeze, even for him.
Sarn.
Will. I hear your voices, but I don't see you, Savine called from the tunnel behind them.
Savine.
We're over here.
Will turned.
Yes, it's me. I came for the same reason you did. The baby dragon wore an illusion of a human boy. Were his clothes real or part of the illusion, hiding his scales? Maybe Sarn didn't need to know. He ran a hand through his hair, but he didn't replace his hood. Sarn had no reason to hide anymore.
Yeah.
We came to check on the foundlings.
They're not dead, Savine said.
How do you know that?
Sarn stared at Savine.
I've heard their voices, but I couldn't run fast enough to catch them. They're always gone by the time I reach them.
Savine shrugged like that wasn't a big deal.
So you came to see if they were living in their cave again.
Sarn wanted all the foundlings to be alive. They didn't deserve to die. But he bit his lip instead of asking whose voices the young dragon heard. I need to see for myself who survived. Will must have felt the same because he didn't ask either.
Yes.
I didn't know where else to look for them.
Savine gripped the air beside him. He was probably holding the end of his tail, but his illusion didn't show it.
So you don't know where they're living now?
Will trudged over to Savine.
I guess not. If you knew, then you wouldn't have come this way.
No, I don't know.
I just know they're not dead.
Savine cocked his head to one side like he was listening to a distant voice or a voice inside his head. Was Thing talking to the young dragon?
Thank you.
Sarn extended his hand and Savine shook it. But that wasn't enough. Sarn pulled the young dragon in for a hug, and that felt better.
Tell Ran I'll come soon.
Stairs are hard on me, but I miss him and Furball.
Savine stepped back when Sarn released him.
I thought it might be something like that though.
Stairs are hard on my brother too. I'll tell my son you say hi.
He'll be glad to hear from you.
He wondered how you are and why you don't visit.
Sarn stifled a yawn. I missed you too.
Will hugged Savine.
I'm even further away than him.
Will waved to Sarn.
Yeah. I figured you'd stayed with the harbor master and his wife.
Are they nice people?
Savine asked when the hug ended.
Yes, they are.
Will smiled at the thought of them. At least he had a home to return to.
But Sarn didn't, and he felt that lack keenly. It's been great catching up with you, but we should go.
You could come with us. Will waved to the tunnel in front of them.
I would, but I need to go.
Mama wants me to run an errand for her.
It was nice seeing you both. Have a good night.
Savine waved to them.
Sarn gave Savine one more hug. Be safe.
I will.
Mom is close by, keeping an eye on me.
Savine smiled and waved as he headed in the opposite direction.
Sarn didn't stop his map from tracking the baby dragon back to his lair. He might need to know where it was if Savine was ever in danger. Sarn just hoped he wouldn't need that information for a while as he banished his map. He didn't need to watch it. His map would track Savine until he told it to stop. And that was great because Sarn had other problems to solve.
Chapter 9.
A New Adventure. The door opened and Thing flew in.
Murren?
I'm here.
Is something wrong?
Murren looked up from the book he was reading aloud, and the story stopped.
Rand scowled at Thing from where he sat next to Furball on the bedroll.
It was bad enough he kept taking Popper away.
Could he at least let Uncle Murren finish the story before he took him away too?
Rand squeezed Bear, but Ghost Bear wasn't home, so Bear didn't complain.
No. Everything is fine. I just need you for a little while. Thing landed on the table.
You do.
Uncle Murren looked like someone had offered him a prize. His eyes widened in surprise and he closed the book.
What about the story? We need to know how it ends. Rand gestured to himself and Furball. His friend had teleported into the flat a few minutes after Papa had left. When asked where he was before, Furball had scrunched his face up and said, "Flying lessons," like it was a curse. A story had been just the thing to take his mind off that. Yes, a story isn't a story without an ending. Furball nodded. Sorry kids, this errand won't wait. Thing extended his empty hands in an apology, but he wasn't sorry. That meant it was important. Rand's eyes widened as he rose. Then I'm coming with you too. This sounded like an adventure, and he needed a nice one after the bad man had shown up earlier. No, you need to stay here and play with Furball. Thing shook his head. Why? Rand folded his arms. He traded a confused glance with his friend, but Furball shrugged. He was just as stumped as Rand by this odd turn in the conversation. I'll come too. Furball rose. Or I can tell you both a story. Amal flew in through the open window behind them. Furball turned to face his grandmother. What kind of story? Rand wanted to know that too. He loved stories. But he also liked to go on adventures. The trip to Inari's home had taken a scary bend. He needed another adventure to make up for that, but Amal didn't tell stories often. Rand scowled. This was a hard decision. Rand pointed at Thing. What do you need Uncle Murren for? Thing sighed and shook his head. It's boring but necessary. What is it? Rand wouldn't let him off the hook that easily. Adults thought if they talked in circles for long enough, they'd lose him. But not this time. I need him to fetch something for me. My arms just aren't long enough to reach it. Thing extended his arms to prove it. He was only 2 feet tall, so his arms were shorter than Rand's. But was he telling the truth? Rand looked at Furball and then Amal, but he couldn't tell if they believed him. Thing could fly, so why couldn't he get the item? Why do I have to stay here if they're just getting something? It made no sense. Adults sometimes didn't, but Thing usually made some attempt at it. I don't believe you. I think you're lying. Okay, fine. Thing lowered his arms and glared at him. I need your uncle to talk to someone for me. Not everyone can handle an awesome creature like myself, and I don't want to scare this person. What do you need to tell him? Rand let his arms fall to his sides. This sounded more plausible. I don't need to tell this person anything. I just need your uncle to ask questions for me while I root around in his mind, not your uncle's mind, the other person's. Rand hadn't needed that clarification, but he nodded. That didn't sound like a fun adventure. Okay. We'll stay here. Rand glanced at his friend and was relieved when Furball nodded. Good, they agreed. Well, time's wasting. We'd better go. Thing flew toward the door after he winked at his mate. I'll be back as soon as I can. Uncle Murren strode out the door with barely a limp. But he'd left his crutch leaning against the wall. Maybe he didn't need it tonight. The door closed behind them as Amal squawked and gripped her head. I'm sorry, boys. I need to leave too. She flew out of the window without an explanation or a backward glance. Where did she go? Do you know? Rand glanced at Furball. But Furball shrugged. She's been gone a lot lately. I don't know what she's up to. But she's up to something. Rand let his gaze drift around the room. What would they do now? I know she is. But she won't say what no matter how many times I ask her. Gramps probably knows because he knows everything. Furball threw his hands in the air in defeat. Adults are weird, especially when they have secrets. Rand shook his head. We need secrets too. Yes, we do. Furball bounced on his little feet and clapped his hands, but they didn't make any sound because his hands and feet were furry. Furball stopped. What's our secret? I don't know yet. We'll have to go on an adventure to find it. Ran found his boots and stuffed his feet into them, then pulled on his cloak. There. He was ready for another adventure. He just needed a snack, and there was some bread and cheese on the sideboard, so he grabbed some and wrapped them in a cloth napkin. Now he was ready. What are you thinking? Furball padded over to join him. We should go right now while it's just you and me in this room. Ran put a finger to his lips to signal for silence. Furball nodded. They tiptoed to the door, and Ran touched the rune that opened it. Nulthar kept the hinges oiled, so the door swung open without making a sound, and they slipped into the hallway. The door waited a moment, then closed on its own. Where will we go on this adventure? Furball clapped his hands since they didn't need to be quiet anymore. Well, they could spy on Uncle Murrin. His little light headed away from them, but Thing might notice them and put an end to their adventure before it began, so that was out. What about Savine? He'd promised to come and play with them, but he hadn't come back, and there was still the other baby dragon. All the adults had forgotten about her, but Ran hadn't. He didn't know how to find her, but Savine might know since he was a baby dragon too. Do you know where Savine is? Ran glanced around. Which way led to the dragons? He's probably with his mom. Do you know where she lives? Furball flapped his little wings until Ran picked him up and set him on his shoulder. She lives downstairs somewhere, not too far from where we used to live. And that brought the foundlings to mind. Ran still didn't know what had happened to them. What if Mama had returned? She would go to their cave to look for him. Could I find our cave? Ran examined the little lights in his head. One was Papa, and one was Uncle Murrin. Auntie Sovan's light was tiny and far away because she was off doing angel stuff still. A fourth light kindled inside his head. Who are you, little light? I'm Savine. The new light bobbed up and down. Ran clapped his hands. I can find Savine, and together we can find the other baby dragon. Papa would be so proud that he'd solved the mystery of what had happened to her. You can? How? Furball kicked his little feet. Well, there's a little light in my head, and I asked it to follow Savine. Ran skipped to the nearest staircase. Chapter 10. Searching for a home. I guess we continue. Will waved to the rock-strewn tunnel ahead. I guess so. We came this far. We might as well go the rest of the way. Sarn climbed over the rocks easily thanks to his magic. It rushed into his hands and feet and pushed them into crevices that would hold his weight. If you'll light my way, I'll follow you. Will climbed onto a boulder. Sarn smiled as he glanced over his shoulder and shined the glow of his eyes on the rocks behind him. Thanks. What for? Will cursed when the rock he grabbed tumbled down the pile. Sarn caught Will's dangling arm and pulled him up. For reminding me I'm not alone. You're welcome. Will stood on the rock pile next to him, and their arms touched. I'll race you to the bottom. All right. Sarn jumped off and skidded down the pile of rocks, only to find more rubble. There was an endless amount of it. We need a better route. Sarn extended his arm to stop Will before his friend reached the bottom. Where else can we go? If this tunnel is full of rubble, won't the rest be like that as well? Will dusted himself off. Maybe. Sarn called up his magic. It had been quiet since the fight with Metron. Over the last month, he hadn't consulted his head map often because relighting Lumiere crystals didn't require a map. He'd gone where he was told, lit the crystals there, and that was it. As Sarn sat there, his earth magic rushed out of his hands and down the boulder. It sent information back as it raced through the lower quarters. Are you all right? Will sat so close to him, their shoulders touched. But Sarn didn't mind because Will was a good friend. He was on a short list of people Sarn trusted. But he didn't like when other people touched him. Other people didn't freak out about that. But I've never been normal. At least the people I like can touch me now. That hadn't been the case for a long span of years. Maybe I finally turned a corner and put the past behind me. Sarn smiled at that thought. It was about time he let go of the past and lived in the present. Sarn, you just stared off and got quiet on me. Are you okay? Will bumped his shoulder. Yeah, I'm finding a better route. It's been a few weeks since I last updated my map of this level. You might as well rest while I do that. Sarn closed his glowing eyes. Inside his mind, his map appeared. It erased some lines and sketched in new ones as his magic radiated out from this boulder. A green man-shaped cloud formed in his peripheral vision. Great. His earth magic wanted to chat. Why do you update me now? You haven't used my map much lately. Sarn massaged the stiff muscles in his neck. Since he was so much taller than everyone he met, he constantly looked down, and that took a toll on him. Because I need to find something. I'm sorry I haven't used your mapping skills more often. Sarn regarded his hands, but his green eyes cast no light on them. He clenched his fists. What did his magic want him to say? He couldn't promise not to give it away. Together, we give light to those who need it. But tonight, you're helping me find something for my friend. And that's important to you? The green man shape floated closer. Yes. If you wanted a destroyer, you should have picked a different man. That's not who I am. I protect people and give them light when you let me. Sarn unclenched his fists. How much longer would his magic doubt him? The green man-shaped cloud stopped an arm's length away and nodded. But you're also an earth shaker and a rock shaper. I'm a finder of lost items and people as well. Will you help me do that too? Sarn reached for that cloud of magic, and it merged with him. The map inside his head exploded into 3 dimensions as something crawled down his cheek. Is it working? Will asked. You're bleeding. Will pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the blood away. It's just a nosebleed. I get them sometimes when I work too much magic. Sarn wiped the blood on his sleeve. It would stop bleeding soon. His map was almost up to date. You still need to face the man who made you promise to obey Gerlo and other people. Until you do, you'll never be free, said his magic. It meant the Lord of the Mountain, Lord Joranth Nalshira. The very man Sarn hoped never to meet again. I can't do that. He could have me executed for having you. Sarn rubbed the back of his neck. According to Murren, there was a mark tattooed there. It was the Lord of the Mountain's personal seal, a wolf howling over a broken sword. A black circle enclosed the mark. His cloak thankfully hid it, but it marked him as Lord Joranth Nalshira's property. Sarn still didn't know why Lord Joranth had spared him. Magic was illegal in this country. Things will never be right between us until you face him and convince him to release you. His magic hadn't needed to remind him of that. The hold Lord Joranth Nalshira had over him scared his magic. Hell, it scared Sarn too. Do you know where Lord Joranth is now? Sarn swallowed the fear that rose just thinking that man's name. Please let him be far from here. His earth magic swept out of him in concentric rings, and they fanned out in all directions. Not here. Updating his map said in that terse way he'd missed. Thank you. Sarn leaned against the rocks behind him as new lines and icons popped up on his map when it refreshed. Things weren't perfect with his magic, but they'd turned a corner, and things would be better now. He just had to keep from screwing up and doing anything to upset it until he could figure out what to do about Lord Joranth, and the promise he'd made almost 7 years ago to obey him. Gerlo's icon didn't appear on his map, but Murren's and Thing's icons did. They were 3 levels above and to his right. Why were they in the library? Metron's icon also appeared, and Valen's too, and both were down here in the lower quarters. They headed toward the low kitchen, and Sarn relaxed because that place wasn't near here or his family. Thank God. Sarn almost pulled the section of his map with Nalthur's flat into focus, but he stopped. What if Rand sensed he was checking on him, and took that as an invitation to come down here? I don't want to make trouble for the Owlcats. Sarn covered his face. He needed to do something about Ran's magic too. Are you sure you're okay? Will bumped his shoulder again. No, Ran has magic, and I don't know what to do about that. Sarn let his hands fall onto his lap and told Will how Ran had found him last week. Teach him. Will shrugged like it was no big deal. Maybe it wasn't. Sarn considered that until an arrow appeared on his map and pointed at the rubble in front of them. Unfortunately, that meant climbing over the gauntlet of broken rocks between them and the next intersection. Damn. I guess we must go this way after all. Sarn rose. So there isn't a better way. Will followed him as he climbed the next rock pile. No. All the debris confused me. We're actually closer than I thought we were, and some of this was here before that monster destroyed parts of the lower quarters. Sarn pulled on his magic to stabilize the rocks when they shifted underfoot. Closer is better. Lead on, and I'll follow as best I can. Will tapped his ankle, and Sarn moved his foot so his friend could use that handhold. Chapter 11. Searching for a dragon. Unfortunately, Savine didn't know they were looking for him, so he kept moving, and all this wandering around was boring. Ran had forgotten how big the lower quarters were. Maybe we should call him. Sound carries. It'll reach him before we do. Furball shrugged. That's a great idea. And it meant they could stop for a bit. Savine. Ran cupped his hands around his mouth to help his voice travel farther, then shouted again. Where are you? Furball imitated him. Ran? Furball. What are you doing down here? Savine rounded a bend ahead. We came to see you. Ran waved to their friend. Savine waved back as he ran toward them with a smile on his snout. He didn't wear his boy illusion over his bronze scales this time, so he must be close to home. Could they meet his mama? Ran hoped so. But first, he needed Savine to join them. We hoped you could adventure with us. We want to find out what happened to the baby dragon. Furball hopped onto Savine's shoulder to give Ran a break from carrying him. Oh, it's not really a mystery. Savine rubbed Furball's head. Why not? Ran bounced on his toes. None of the adults in his life knew about this either. Already his adventure had borne fruit. The Rangers have a commander. Savine drew the word commander out, giving it special importance. I know. Papa doesn't get along with him. He doesn't want Papa to use magic. Ran didn't understand why. Magic is cool. I need to find that commander and give him a piece of my mind. But he'd need to bring Uncle Murrin with him. Maybe we can do that tomorrow. Well, he took care of the baby dragon. Her name is Star, and she's the most beautiful dragon I've ever seen besides Mama. In fact, I hear the commander calling. Don't you? Savine cocked his head to one side, as if he were listening to distant voices. Ran looked at Furball, and they both shook their heads. If Furball had the mind gift like his grandparents, it must not be working, because he was as baffled as Ran. Ran tapped Savine's arm to get his attention. We don't hear anything. I hear him, and so does Mama. He wants Mama. Savine nodded to something only he heard. Why does he want an adult dragon? A baby dragon sounded more fun to Ran. Adults were so weird. Furball must have thought the same thing because his furry brow was as crinkled as Ran's. I don't know. Savine shrugged. Did he bring the baby dragon with him? Ran wanted to see her. Papa said she had silver scales, but Ran couldn't picture that. No, she's with Mama. Savine shrugged. I hear him, but I don't see him. So you don't know where he is? Furball asked before Ran could. No. He could be anywhere. I hear him in my head, not with my ears. So this commander was like Thing, but he could mind talk with dragons, and that was cool. Ran wanted to meet him one day. But Papa would probably say no. He liked to keep his work friends a secret for some reason. Was he ashamed of them? Can we meet your mama? Furball clasped his furry hands together. Let me ask Mama. Savine stared off for a moment. Were they mind-talking? Can everyone mind-talk except me? Ran hoped not, because that just wasn't fair. Mama, Ran repeated as he thought of his own mama. She'd gone away many months ago, and he missed her. Familiar voices heartened him, and he hurried toward them. Ran left his friends behind as new lights blossomed in his head. Ran, where are you going? Furball asked. To check something. I'll be right back. Ran made like his namesake and hurried around a bend and into a narrow tunnel following those new lights. Savine and Furball's lights grew smaller as he sped toward the foundlings, but that was okay. He'd find them later. A glow ahead lit his way as he careened around fallen rocks and shot into a wide tunnel with lots of people. Papa's voice echoed in his head. Don't talk to strangers. But how could he find the foundlings if he didn't talk to at least one stranger? Adults didn't think about these things when they made their silly rules. Ran grabbed the hem of a woman's skirt and tugged. Excuse me. Do you know where I can find the foundlings? Yes, I do, Moirena said as she turned to face him. She would know since she was one of them. Did Mama come back? The question burst out of Ran as he let go of her skirt. But she hadn't gotten along well with Mama before she disappeared, so Moirena scowled at him. Maybe I should find another foundling to ask. Ran turned to do that, but a hand landed on his arm and seized it. Uh-oh. I might be in trouble. But Papa wasn't here to bail him out. Oops. Chapter 12. I won't tell you. I can't let you do this. Mosul appeared in front of him and extended both arms to block him, but Stramos strode right through him because Mosul wasn't corporeal enough to stop him. Damn it. There must be a way. Mosul kept that thought to himself. You can't stop me. You need a body for that, and I'm in control right now. Stramos headed for the prison. Mosul couldn't give up without a fight. What else could he do other than try to unseat Stramos and take control? Stramos was a demon, and he could just oust him again. Unfortunately, Stramos' powers were suited to this sort of battle. I beg you. Don't do this. Mosul floated after him. I must. It's the only way, and you know it. Stramos kept striding through the lower quarters as if he owned the place, and no one accosted him. He radiated power, and the denizens of the lower quarters darted into their caves or turned and went another way. There'd be no help from them. And strangely enough, no thugs roamed around these tunnels either, probably because the prison was in the next cavern. Stramos passed guards in blue uniforms, but they headed either for a break or to their homes because their shifts were over. They didn't even glance at them as they passed. Stramos might have cast a glamour over their body, so the guards would see one of their own. They worked well enough to fool regular folk, but it would never stand up to mage sight. Unfortunately, the only mage under this mountain wasn't anywhere in sight, and there was no way to contact Sarn either. I won't ask where you stashed Hadroval because you won't tell me. Stramos crossed the bridge over the moat surrounding the stone prison. You're right. I won't tell you. Mosul stepped back into their body. But it was too late because Stramos glimpsed it in his mind, but he didn't know which cell, and that was something. Hopefully, he wouldn't find Hadroval anywhere. But that wasn't likely, because Hadroval hadn't left the prison like Mosul hoped when he'd opened his cell door. This whole thing was such a mess. Oh God. They were already striding under the portcullis. Mosul tried to remember which cell block he'd left Hadroval in, so he could try to lead Stramos away from it. Who goes there? A guard stepped out of a small room on the side near the controls that closed the portcullis. I do. I have business in the prisons tonight. Stramos didn't stop. He pulled the shadows around him and disappeared long enough to pass the guard and enter the prison. Stop. Visiting hours are over. Where are you? The guard slid to a stop behind them, but there weren't any lit Lumiere crystals in this tunnel, and darkness had always been Stramos' friend. I don't have time for that, Stramos muttered as he turned into the tunnel that wrapped around the cell blocks. Other tunnels intersected this one, like spokes on a wheel. Mosul couldn't remember how many there were, and they divided the prison into slices. Where should I start searching? Stramos turned into the first cell block and scanned the cells. The darkness wouldn't hide Hadroville from him for long. I won't tell you. You've put Sarn through enough. Mosul wouldn't help him. No argument would sway him, not about this. I'm not interested in him anymore. I'm just using him to get to his sister. Stramos reached the end of the cell block and turned into the tunnel leading to the next one. But he was lying. Mosul did want to punish her for harming them. But was that wound crime enough to warrant what Stramos was planning? You want her to redeem me, right? Well, she can't do that if she isn't here. Stramos turned into another cell block. They all looked the same in the dark. Cells lined both sides of the narrow tunnel, but their doors were closed. Stramos glanced through each cell's barred window to check for Hadroville, then strode to the next cell in the row. But you don't want to be redeemed. Mosul wished that wasn't so. Let him do this, Bechtel whispered in his ear. The ghost appeared to the left, but Stramos didn't look at him. Didn't he see Bechtel? Mosul fell out of their body when Bechtel grabbed his spirit and yanked. Let go of me. Mosul tried to break his grip, but the cells spun around him. Why am I so dizzy? What did you do to me? Mosul tilted as he hovered beside Bechtel. Ahead, Stramos stopped and glanced around. Mosul, where did you go? Couldn't Stramos hear him? I'm over here. Mosul waved when Stramos turned, but the demon looked right through him as if he weren't there. What have you done to me? Mosul turned his anger on its rightful target and swung a fist at Bechtel, but he'd been a scholar, not a fighter. Bechtel shook him, and his punch went wide of the mark. I told you to let him do this. Bechtel glared at him, and once upon a time that would have scared him, but not anymore. Why do you want this to happen? What will you gain from it? Because he must gain something, or he wouldn't push for it this much. Mosul tugged, but Bechtel yanked him aside when Stramos doubled back to look for him. At least this little drama had delayed him. Mosul, where are you? Stramos cast about for him. I'll be along in a moment, Bechtel said, imitating Mosul's mind voice, but Stramos ignored it. Hopefully he hadn't heard that ghost. How did you do that? Mosul stared at Bechtel. He hadn't known someone could counterfeit another person's mind voice. With magic, of course. There are more types of it in this world than you ever dreamed of, but you were always too dense to see that. Bechtel dragged him around a bend after Stramos. And Bechtel had somehow tapped into that power after death. Who are you? Because you're not who you're pretending to be. Bechtel died when Zale broke through the summoning circle. Bechtel wasn't this powerful then, but he was ruthless. That part was correct. Mosul studied the ghost, but he had Bechtel's face, his receding hairline and stringy beard. Are you that slow-witted from age, or have you figured out what's going on yet? Bechtel turned in the opposite direction from Stramos and poked his head through the door of every cell they passed. You struck a deal with someone after death. That much was clear from his behavior. Mosul didn't need Bechtel to confirm it. But who was the fool working for? Who do you think I'm working for? Where is he? Bechtel squeezed his arm, and it shouldn't have hurt because they were both ghosts, but pain radiated through his soul as Bechtel ripped the location from his mind. For that moment they were connected mind to mind. Mosul saw his plan, and he gaped. You're working for the adversary? Bechtel nodded. Where do you think I went when Vale killed me? Not to heaven, that was for sure. Its gates were closed to dark magic users. Mosul stared at him. You went to hell. Bechtel flew toward another cell block and dragged Mosul behind him. Yes, its manager offered me a deal and I couldn't refuse. Mosul closed his eyes. He didn't need to hear the rest. The adversary wanted Sarn and his sister. But he's locked out of this world. The adversary can't take him. Bechtel stopped in front of a scarred door. He doesn't need to if your demon drags Sarn to hell. Bechtel grinned at him over his shoulder. But the joke was on him. Stramos wouldn't drag anyone to hell. That was the last place the young demon would go. Stramos had spent most of his short life here among mortals, and he liked them too much to leave. That was probably why his attempt to make minions had failed. But Stramos was a demon. Could the adversary manifest through him and force him to transport Sarn to hell? Mosul put that worry out of mind for now, because something was missing. What do you get out of this? So far I've heard what the devil gains, but not what you get for orchestrating this. Bechtel shrugged. What do you think I get? Not a one-way trip out of hell. Mosul couldn't imagine the adversary letting anyone leave hell for long. But he didn't need Bechtel to reply, because why else would he want Sarn trapped? You need a body that wields magic, so you want to possess Sarn. Bechtel laughed. Of course I do. I've wanted his power for years, and now I have a way to take it. But I can't have you interfering anymore. Bechtel waved, and the shadows beneath the nearby cell door reached for Mosul. Stramos. Mosul struggled, but the shadows wrapped around him. Bechtel waved as he floated away. Farewell, old friend. Say hello to the devil for me. Bechtel turned and pitched his mind voice to sound like Mosul again. I've changed my mind. I'll tell you where Hadroval is. Bechtel pointed a spectral hand at the door in front of him. But Stramos didn't reply. Stramos, where are you? Bechtel floated away to search for him as the shadows pulled Mosul into the ground. Stramos, don't listen to him. But his thoughts couldn't pass through the darkness trapping Mosul. They echoed in his mind as he called again for the young demon who'd become a son to him. Chapter 13. Mind Games. Sleep, crooned a dragon's mind voice. It was so loud, Amal couldn't ignore it. What are you doing? She used the same wavelength, but the mother dragon didn't reply. Amal knew her name, but the dragon didn't want anyone else to know. Amal ground her beak, but she didn't call the dragon's name, even though that might get a response. Don't poke a dragon in her lair. She could inhale you by accident. Thing, of course, sent an image of that. Her mate had a vivid imagination. Amal squawked in surprise. She hadn't realized Thing was listening. Ran and Furball stared at her. Oh right, she'd volunteered to tell them a story. I'm sorry, boys. I need to leave too. Amal flew out of the window and left the two kids behind, but they weren't alone. Furball's parents were in the next room, and so were his aunt and uncle. The two kids would be fine in the flat for a bit. They'd probably play a game until she returned. What are you doing, honey? Aside from sending me disturbing pictures. Amal flew around the side of the mountain toward Gerlo's suite. Hopefully the window was unlocked. If not, she'd just fly around to a balcony and enter the stronghold that way. I'm talking to Murren about his brother, and trying to learn more about the progression of his magic. Sarn is too powerful for someone so young. Thing sent a picture of Murren and him in a dark alcove near the library. Sleep, crooned the mother dragon again, but she wasn't mind talking to her younglings. Why are you sending Gerlo to sleep? Amal landed on his windowsill while she waited for the dragon to reply. Should I wake him? When Thing didn't reply to the question she'd sent him, she poked his mind. It wasn't like him to be so quiet. Are you ignoring me? He'd better not be if he knew what was good for him. Amal opened and closed her claws on the windowsill. Lumiere crystal light lit Gerlo's sleeping face because the sun was setting on the other side of the mountain. But the window was closed even though humans needed fresh air as much as owlcats did. Amal glared at the closed window until a Lesseraya appeared on the other side of it. What do you want? The angel folded her arms, but she didn't open the window. On the bed to her left, sweat beaded Gerlo's brow. Was he struggling to wake up? Do you need me? Thing shoved his way into her head and peered out of her eyes. I always need you. Amal pushed him out. But you should finish what you started. You may not get another chance to question Murren without his brother or nephew around. And Ran would tell Sarn about that if he saw it. That adorable boy liked to talk. That's why I grabbed him for a chat. This was the first opportunity I've had in the past week. Because Thing spent a lot of time with Nulthar. But Thing didn't retract his mind. Maybe he could watch and talk to Murren at the same time. I came to see how Gerlo is doing. Has he woken up yet? Amal tapped on the glass in between her and the scowling angel. He woke a few times, and I got him to eat something before he closed his eyes again. But he hasn't woken up again today. I'd be concerned if he hadn't touched a portal. It drained him, but he'll wake when he's ready. Don't interfere. Alessariah shook her finger at Amal. Amal snapped at her and regretted that when her beak struck the glass. She rubbed it and glared at that angel. Thankfully, she hadn't hit the stained glass hard enough to crack it. What's got your armor in a twist? Alessariah collapsed onto the edge of the bed and stared at her clenched fists in her lap. I feel so helpless. I don't know what to do except wait, and I'm not good at waiting. Have you tried waking him? Amal peered through the glass, but Gerlo lay as still as a corpse. No. I've been letting him wake on his own or not at all, depending on what his body needs at the time. You saw what happened. Did I pull him away in time? Or did some part of him go through the portal? Alessariah rose and paced the room, but she only took 3 steps before she had to turn because of the closet, which was full of the same dark green uniform Gerlo was wearing. Don't tell her, the mother dragon said in her mind, and it wasn't hard to figure out what she didn't want Amal to tell Alessariah. I should tell her. What you're doing is dangerous. Amal folded her arms, then remembered her mate. Honey, can you check Gerlo's mind and allay some of Alessariah's fears? If there was some damage from his grab for the portal, then they needed to know now. Of course. Thing landed beside her and nuzzled her neck. Amal chortled. He always found the most ticklish spot. Enough, honey. You have work to do. Amal pointed at Gerlo. So I do. Thing cracked his knuckles. Why is he here? Alessariah stalked to the window and pointed at Thing. But Thing just puffed out his chest and grinned at her. I'm a mind mage if you couldn't tell, and I'm here to check the mind of your chosen to make sure it's all there. The mother dragon tried to send him deeper into sleep too. Should we wake him? Amal stepped aside to give her mate room. I heard that. I'll check that too. Did you find out why? Thing tapped on the glass. Can you open this so I can see my patient? What will you do to him? Alessariah rested a hand on the latch, but she didn't turn it. Is she always this difficult? Thing glanced skyward for patience. Yes, but to be fair, I only met her a few weeks ago, and we live in trying times at the moment. Amal shrugged. Maybe Alessariah was sweet and patient when the world wasn't ending. Hopefully, they'd get a chance to find out. Sovan was a good girl. If anyone could figure out this apocalypse mess and stop it, then she would. I just want to examine him. That's all. But you have to let me in first. Thing rapped on the glass. Do you swear that's all you'll do? Alessariah glared at him, but her hand shook where it gripped the latch. Yes, is there anything else you need? Thing waved away her concern. No, you'd better come in. Alessariah opened the window and stepped back to give them room. After you, my sweet. Thing bowed to her. Thank you. Amal hopped through the gap and glided over to the headboard, which was a wrought iron tangle of dragons. Don't wake him up, the mother dragon shouted as Thing descended.
He covered his ears and would have missed the bed if Amal hadn't grabbed his arm. What was that about? Thing dropped onto the pillow next to Gerlo's head. Maybe you can get her to explain, because she's not answering me. Amal smoothed down her feathers. Get who to explain? What are you talking about? Alessariah glanced between them and waited for an explanation. Do you want to explain, or shall I? Thing quirked a brow. Explain what? The mother dragon won't talk to me. And that hurt because Amal was a mother too, and an aunt and a grandmother and a babysitter, and all the roles that came with little ones underfoot. But owlcat kits were easier to pull out of trouble than baby dragons, so she could understand some of the dragon's reluctance. Thank God Furball teleported less often with ran around. Sarn's son was a good influence on her grandson. Amal wondered what game they were playing tonight, then cast that thought aside. The two boys never got into any real trouble, but maybe baby dragons did. They might need far more supervision than one human child and one owlcat kit did. Amal thought about checking on them, but children's minds were so malleable. She didn't want to interfere with their growth and development. So why risk it when the two were probably stacking rocks again? Do you want me to check on them? Thing glanced at her. No, I'm sure they're fine. But she could reach out to her daughter and ask her to check. Make him stop, the mother dragon shouted before Amal could mind talk to Mixie. Instead, she clung to the headboard with all her might until the dragon's mind voice stopped bouncing around inside her skull. What could have upset that dragon now? Chapter 14. It's gone. Will elbowed him in the side. Do you think they're still there? Sarn wondered the same thing when the debris had only increased. Was anything still standing in this area? Or had the Age-Eldar destroyed it all? I don't know. We'll find out in a couple of 100 feet. Sarn slid down another rock pile. He'd lost track of how many piles of rocks he'd scaled and descended in this never-ending trek. His shoulders slumped when a wall of rocks stood between him and his goal. We can move it, said his magic. But we'll have to hold some of it in place to keep the ceiling from collapsing. Do you wish to continue? Did he? Yes, I need to know what's behind there. Sarn rested his hands on the nearest rock and let his magic investigate the stones surrounding it to find one it could move without disturbing the pile too much. When it had an answer, a boulder at eye level glowed green. Sarn touched it, and it leapt out of the pile and into his hands. His earth magic dived into the hole and held the pile in place. Another rock glowed green, and Sarn repeated the process until he'd rearranged the pile into a doorway just wide enough for them to squeeze through. Come on. Sarn waved for Will to follow. How long will this hold? Will backed away from him. Long enough for us to see what we need to and come back. My magic can hold it in place while we do that. Sarn gestured to the green light around the doorway, supporting it. After this, Sarn would need rest and probably food. But he could take care of that later. If you say it'll hold, then it'll hold. Will clapped him on the back, and they stepped through the doorway. But Sarn wasn't prepared for the devastation. It's all gone. He dropped to his knees in despair. His home no longer stood, and neither did the Foundling's cave. This whole section had collapsed. Only part of the tunnel that had connected the two caves still stood, and the rest was covered in tons of gray rocks. Will squeezed his shoulder to remind him he wasn't alone. Nor was he the only one who'd lost something tonight. It's gone, Sarn repeated because he couldn't get past that as he covered the hand squeezing his shoulder. That cave had been so much more than the rocks that had formed it. It was the only home his son had ever known, and now it was gone, along with their few possessions. Where will we live now? What will we do? Sarn stared at the rubble, but it didn't disappear because it wasn't a cruel trick. It was real, and he was homeless. How can I tell my family? Ran might not care because Nulthur's flat was so much better than their dank cave. Maybe Murren wouldn't either. His commute to school was much shorter from Nulthur's flat, and there weren't any stairs in the way.
Had all the foundlings left in time? Or were some buried under the rocks in front of them? Savine had heard their voices, but he hadn't seen them. And Sarn hadn't been there to warn them. I can't handle this, not after what happened with Inari and my son. It was too much. Sarn wiped his eyes on his sleeve. Will laced their fingers together. What do you want to do now? Sarn shook his head. I don't know. In all the tales, the hero saves the day and wins the girl. But he has a home to return to, and I don't. Not anymore. Sarn hung his head. He had a son and a brother he was raising. Why can't I give them a stable home? A white and purple glow drew his gaze to the bond with his twin. That luminous chain extended as he stared at it. I guess I did win the girl after all. I got my sister back. Sarn smiled at that thought. I could use your humor right now, sis. But she didn't answer. You have a sister? Will let go and stepped back. Yeah. She died when we were 7, but she's an angel now, and she found a way to return. I don't understand it, but I don't think she does either. Sarn touched their bond. You never mentioned her before. Will didn't ask why, but his shoulder slumped in defeat. Because I blocked it out. I didn't remember her until she showed up again. Sarn stopped talking. He didn't want to discuss that because Sovan had first appeared when he'd fought the demon who'd lived inside his ex-friend's body. Oh Shade, why didn't you tell me you were possessed? I would have found a way to free you. But Shade hadn't said anything at all until it was too late. Now Shade was gone, and the hole in his heart Shade's betrayal and death had left was healing, thanks to his siblings and his son. God, what would he tell them when he went back upstairs? Sarn scrubbed a hand over his face. Can I meet her? Will rested a hand on his shoulder again as white light blinded them. Meet who? Sovan appeared on his other side. Sarn laughed because that was the last thing he'd expected to happen. But he sobered enough to make introductions. Will, meet my twin sister. Sovan, this is my friend Will. Hi Will. It's nice to meet you. Sovan extended her hand to him, then nudged Sarn with her knee. Why are you kneeling? Why did you come? Sarn wiped his eyes again, but these were happy tears. Because your guardian angel said you needed me. We're friends now, I guess. Sovan shrugged. Where are we? This doesn't look like Mount Eredron. It is. We're in the lower quarters, deep under the mountain. But Sarn understood her confusion. If you're an angel, then how can you be here? Will glanced between them. I've got skills. Sovan shoved her bell sleeves up to her elbows and struck a pose. How long can you stay? Sarn wiped his eyes again. They just kept leaking tears. Probably because I'm broken inside. Not long. Are you okay? Sovan nudged him again. No, but he would be okay eventually, so he nodded. Sarn rose and she flung her arms around him. He held her tight and she squeezed him too. Will leaned in and whispered, You weren't kidding. She looks just like you. Since Will was shorter than him, his lips were closer to Sovan's ears than his. Sovan turned and glared at Will. Why wouldn't he look like me? I was born first. She raised both eyebrows. Will wisely backed away with his hands raised. I didn't know you were the eldest. Well, now you do, and you'd better treat my little brothers well. Sovan shook her index finger at Will. Who are you calling little? I'm taller than you by several inches. Sarn turned her to face him. So? I'm still older than you. Sovan tapped her index finger on his chest to make her point. Yeah, by like 1 hour. Sarn rolled his eyes. So? It still counts, and because of that 1 hour, my birthday is on a different day than yours. Sovan winked at him. Her violet eyes had that mischievous twinkle in them again. That was true, but perhaps he should direct the conversation to a new topic. What have you been doing since I saw you last? Sarn still couldn't believe they'd finally talked like siblings should. I had to do some angel stuff. This elevation in rank came with some work too. Sovan shrugged. But she was being vague on purpose. Wait, you have a job now? Sarn couldn't believe it, but he hoped he hadn't misheard. That would be something else they'd have in common. Yeah, I died and got a job. Who knew that was possible? Sovan threw her hands in the air. But you don't want to talk about it. Sarn tried not to smile at the news that she had a job. Not now. It's complicated. When I have a handle on things, we'll talk about it. I promise. Sovan twisted a stray lock that had escaped her braid around her index finger. You don't have to do that. Sarn wrapped an arm around her. Do what? Sovan batted her lashes and pretended she didn't know what he was talking about. You don't need to promise me things. Now it was Sarn's turn to roll his eyes. Sovan waved that away. Oh bah. I'm your twin. I can promise you things if I want to. But promises are binding, Sarn reminded her, especially for him. I know. I want them to bind me. Sovan patted his shoulder. So, will you tell me what upset you so much your angel demanded I go see you immediately? Don't get the wrong idea. I'm glad for the break. This work thing is hard. I don't like it. Because you've never worked before. You'll get the hang of it. Sarn patted her shoulder. Sovan glared at him. I don't want to get the hang of it. I want to give the job to someone else and go back to guarding you. That was more fun. Sovan flickered for a moment, then stabilized. Now who's calling me? Can't they sense I'm busy? She clenched her fists. If they need you, then you should go. Sarn didn't want her to leave, but he understood obligations. Sovan folded her arms. You're changing the subject. I'll go after you. Tell me what upset you. It's nothing. Sarn stared at the rubble where his cave had stood. He'd grieve for it in private. His former home was gone, and there was no reason to remain here except to find the foundlings. Savine said they were alive. I should search for them, but I don't want to find them. Not after they'd revealed his biggest secret to Metron. Will squeezed his shoulder and reminded him he wasn't grieving this loss alone. Will had also lost the only home he'd ever known. Sovan didn't need to share that or shoulder that pain. She didn't know about the foundlings or Rand's mother or any of that drama, and Sarn didn't want to rehash that now, but someday he'd have to tell her. It's not nothing. Sovan wiped a tear from his cheek. But if you'd rather tell me another time, that's okay too. I'll listen when you're ready to talk about it. I love you. Sovan hugged him hard enough to make her point, and her halo floated to the side again, so it didn't hit his forehead. Thank you. We will talk about it, just not now. Maybe in a few weeks he could handle that. Sarn returned the hug, then let go. It was nice meeting you. Sovan extended her hand to Will again. Same here. Will shook it. Take care of my brother. Sovan tilted her head in Sarn's direction as Will let go. I will. Will backed away. I'd tell you to stay out of trouble, but then you'd tell me the same thing, and we both know that's impossible. Sovan gave Sarn that crooked grin that always made her look like she was up to something. True. Be safe, sis. Sarn tried not to laugh because she was right. You too. Hug Ran and Murren for me. Sovan waved. I will. Sarn stepped back as his sister faded. She's beautiful. Your sister, I mean. Will ran a hand through his hair. Is she? I hadn't noticed. Sarn touched the scar on the left side of his face and sat on some rubble. But if she was beautiful, what did that make him since he looked like her? Sovan's words echoed in his head from last week. You should smile more.
You look like a prince from a fairy tale when you do. I don't want to look like that. Enough people stare at me because of my eyes. But now Sarn wasn't sure if that was the only reason they stared at him. Was Sovan right?